Hi, this is Steve, and here are some more of my gaming vexes. Welcome. Today we're revisiting one of my all-time favourite games, the One Ring role-playing game. Those who've listened to episode 14, recorded way back in May 2021, know that we've got a special fondness for gaming in Professor Tolkien's great secondary world. In that episode, we talked about our broader experiences in role-playing in Middle-earth, touching on our history with Middle-earth role-playing, or MERP, and the One Ring amongst other games. Those who follow some of the podcast contributors on social media will know that our enjoyment of the One Ring RPG, or tour, hasn't dimmed at all. In fact, we hold an annual gaming weekend where we either kick off or conclude the latest tour campaign we're involved with. We've played through the Oath of the Riddermark campaign, the Laughter of Dragons, and most recently the Tales from the Lone Lands. Given all the other games vying for our attention, it's clear that this game is something special. The first edition of the One Ring was published by Cubicle 7 in 2011. Designed by Francesco Nepatello and Marco Maggi, it focused on the narrative journey and looming threat of Mordor, set between the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. This edition saw numerous supplements expanding the game's scope and depth. Subsequently, Free League Publishing acquired the licence and announced a second edition. This new edition, also designed by Francesco Nepatello, was released in 2022. It featured revised rules, updated presentation and new artwork, while retaining the core themes and mechanics that made the game so popular. In this episode, we delve deeply into the game, so deeply that at various points we're in real danger of awakening a fire demon from the elder days. The recording itself took place over 3 separate evenings over a couple of months, so if the discussion is even more disjointed than usual, let's blame that, shall we? As you may expect, it's a long episode, one of those for the real devotees or slightly crazy people amongst you. But we had a great time recording the episode, so even if you're not as dedicated to the One Ring game as we are, you may still find something of value glinting away in the darkness. Before we get stuck in though, we've had a couple of reviews. As you may know, podcasts can be reviewed on all sorts of different platforms, so sometimes we only find reviews by accident, so apologies for the delay in acknowledging them. The first review dates from late in 2024 and comes from the FJDFJ, I think that's right, from the Netherlands. They say, "Reviews inspiring play. The podcast always gives insightful reviews of games based on actual play experiences, all delivered in a genial discussion between the players. The panel offers a range of well-reasoned opinions which sometimes even rise to actual vexes. It frequently inspires interest in the games being discussed even when I would previously have dismissed them. So thanks, the FJDFJ, that's very much appreciated." The second review is from Salty Light and comes from probably about a year ago. This one is a little bit shorter to the point and is a 1-star review and says, "Woke turds in this otherwise great punch bowl turn my stomach." Thanks, Salty Light, for that insightful and frankly disturbing visual metaphor. I think it's fair to say that we value a 1-star review of someone like you almost as much as we would a 5-star review from someone else. Both reviews seem to show that we're heading in the right direction. For everyone else, please feel free to leave a review as you see fit. But if you do, please let me know so I can find it and give you a shout out on the podcast. So, with that, let's set out to see what the wildlands hold for us. Get ready. What we'll do, we'll go around, we'll introduce ourselves. I think everyone on this podcast knows us probably more intimately than they want to know us anyway. We're going to talk about the One Ring. We actually had this is a request. We had somebody I couldn't find the name of the person who requested this. So would you do a deep dive into the One Ring role-playing game? And I said, I'd be very happy to. So here we are today. On this podcast, we'll start with, for the first time in a long time, we managed to con somebody who actually knows what they're talking about when it comes to games, designing games and that sort of stuff, to come and share their knowledge with us. And then everyone else will share their knowledge and I will witter around it. There you go. So first of all, Paul, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Paul Mitchener. I am the Tweedmeister on Blue Sky. I've popped on this podcast before, usually talking about my own games. This time I'm talking about someone else's game. This is good. but it is actually one of my absolute favourite games. So it'll be a pleasure to talk about it.
Okay, hi. Yes, I'm Neil Benson, old Scouse role player. I'm on Blue Sky as old Scouse of Heat, and I have played the One Ring extensively, I would say, to you, Steve. I'm sure we'll get onto it. We've done 3 of the major campaign pieces, which have all been fantastic. And I've run it myself, run a couple of the 5th edition modules using the 2nd edition rule.
Hello, David Patterson. I am Dave Atters on Blue Sky. Of course, this isn't the original Lord of the Rings Middle-earth role-playing game, which was, of course, Merp, which is the one true game everybody really ought to aspire to play on a regular basis, but you saddos just haven't seen the light yet. I've played the One Ring several times now, always with Steve, I think, as GM, but I do like it. I like it because it's slightly different in its punch. I think there's lots to recommend.
Hi, I'm Martin. I'm mcookie123 on Blue Sky. I have played and run 2nd edition The One Ring. I have also played Merp. But I will remain. I'll draw a veil over that.
Lived.
Was that the game I run at Grogmeet? Was that one? Or
I played it back in the day as well, but yes,
Yeah.
that's my most recent experience, obviously.
If you're really unlucky, I'll regale my tales of toolkits of playing Rollmaster. Second, in German, not fluent.
Wow, just to make things more complicated for yourselves.
So, yeah, Rick Knott at Lintillas on Blue Sky and Mastodon. And I've played, I haven't run it, but I've played a shed load of One Ring, 1st and 2nd edition with Steve and quite a few others on the podcast. And as for one true game, I think there is a competitor nobody mentions, which is Adventures in Middle-earth, but obviously there are advantages to that one, I think.
It might be worth sort of touching on that later on if we get a chance. We'll chance at some point. You've run it for us, and I did it. Dave's just shown us his Rollmaster. Okay, get your Rollmasters out, lads. Here we go. Hang on.
Yep.
Go on, it's started now. Here we go.
Oh, God, if I knew this was going to be who's got the biggest shelf.
I can't get me Shadow World off the shelf.
Time passes. Thorin starts talking about gold.
Okay.
Oh, for 5 minutes.
Right, got him deep there, Dave. I played Rollmaster back in the day once, and I've been scarred by it ever since. I still have nightmares now. And I'm feeling traumatic flashbacks with you just showing me that stuff there, Dave.
Yeah, that'll all be edited out. So,
This is gold, Steve.
okay, all right. So I think between all of us, we've got pretty good experience of both running the One Ring, so in 1st edition and 2nd edition as well. Now, so I've run games through 1E and 2E. I can remember very little about 1E, okay? So I think, Paul, you've probably got a little bit more recent experience. So we can do a bit of a comparison, even better but really this is more about 2nd edition, about our thoughts around that one. So what we'll do, we'll just go through, we basically go through the rule book. I mean, we all are going to talk about, as Martin suggested, some of the other stuff that's been come out for it as well, particularly around the starter set and also some of the supplements. And we can talk about the sort of adventures that seem to be coming out for 2nd edition, which they're a little bit darker than some of the other scenarios you might have seen in the past, but we can touch on that as well. First of all, let's talk about, so again, we're just going to work through the rule book. So the prologue itself in the book, the game itself is quite procedural in style. So it's very carefully differentiates between adventuring phase and the fellowship phase, which I think if you're coming from other games, perhaps like 5e, for example, that's more of a division than you might say. I don't think 5e has a lot of downtime stuff activities in there, but it certainly is something that's, for example, Jackals makes a big play of, you got a difference between adventuring and downtime activities, as does fancy role play. I don't know if anyone's got any thoughts about that.
Personally, I like it. I like the way that you can do that, and actually it shows passage of time where you've got time in between adventures and things. There's certain activities going on, and you've got the fairly constructive choice of activities to do, the downtime. Especially, okay, I am going to make the 1st and 2nd edition comparison. 2nd edition, of course, is a lot more streamlined. 1st edition, especially when you start bringing in all the supplements, there's a lot more flavour and a lot more choice. But I think we're comparing 1st edition plus all the supplements with 2nd edition, so maybe that's a slightly unfair thing to say one has more flavour than the other. I like the existence of that. And I do like the way it shows, like, gives you passage of time.
So I'd agree with Paul. I think it's just really useful. There's nothing that disrupts play more than somebody leveling up halfway through a session and wanting their new power and so on. And that can be really annoying. So you can just leave it till the end, to the fellowship phase. But also I think it fits. One of the great, I'm sure we'll come back to this again and again, but one of the brilliant things about TOR is it just fits the setting. And so the idea, if you are on a huge journey, which has got multiple bits to it, you're going to have time to stop and have a fellowship phase in, I don't know, in Rivendell or in Lothlorien or in Tom Bombadil's house. So yeah, you heard. So I think it fits with that as well, which I really like. Big fan.
I think that's probably the issue with not just Middle-earth roleplay, MERP as was, but I think virtually any game. One of the biggest issues is the immersion in what's being created. I think one of the things that Ring does really is it takes you into the world of Tolkien. And I think it does it by those things like fellowship. I think you create a better group of PCs because you have there's lots of interaction. There's lots of things that you're doing without fighting stuff or running away from stuff. And even when you're traveling, you all have roles. As you would find in the books, everybody has a role. Everybody takes a sort of a role. And I think, as Martin quite rightly said, I think the immersion piece in Middle-earth is one of the things that One Ring does really well as a role-playing game.
Yeah, I get you. And we'll come back to that, I'm sure, because obviously talking about, say, fellowship phase, but also we'll talk about hope and those sort of things. And there's a lot of mechanisms that sort of really support that.
I guess generally, like a lot of games I've played in the past, downtime hasn't always been a thing. Martin talked about leveling up and so on. With the One Ring, it's not like, I like the fellowship phase, doesn't really interfere with the game at all. It flows naturally and it doesn't take a great deal of time. So you think about the adventures we've heard of. There's the thing about the Oath of the Riddermark, for example. I know that was a 1E adventure, but we had a certain like chapter and then we had some downtime in Edoras, for example. And then we had another chapter and some downtime. But the adventuring phase probably lasts like, 96, 97, 98% of what we're doing. And the fellowship phase is a really small part. But it just fits in really nicely. I think you kind of look forward to it. You've got those points stored up, ready to spend. You've got an idea what you might want to do, and you come out the other side off a little bit through, which is
also a chance to get rid of some of those shadow points as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing it does do, like Neil says, 96, 97% of the time, your abilities stay the same. There is no change. It takes a long time to get the opportunity to improve what you've got, which means naturally there's not as much emphasis on your character sheet and the things that you can do. It's much more on the character because it all stays the same. It doesn't really advance as quickly. So there's much more emphasis on character, naturally. Puts more load on the GM, of course, because you haven't got all those little treats constantly coming along. So that makes a difference. But I think it does put more emphasis on character and more emphasis on role play as a result.
Yeah, we'll come back to this later. We'll talk about things like equipment and stuff, but it's not a game where you end up with lots of stuff. You might have a few bits and pieces, so bits of war gear and whatever, but really, and again, perhaps I'm a bit of a stingy GM, but you don't end up getting a lot of treasure, but really, it's not a game where you end up with cash to spend, which I quite like, really, because I think it's all the cash in games is a pain, frankly. Okay, cool. All right. So overall, I'd say this is a little bit of a mechanistic break. It's not that unusual, I don't think now. I think we've seen it in a lot of games. Paul, I'm going to apologise. I don't know if it's something that you introduce into your games particularly, make it overt.
There's a little of that definitely in House of the Ashes.
Yeah.
And it's a community building element there, but
yeah. Okay. I know you don't want to talk about any of your games. You're not here to talk about those today, are you, Paul?
I'm averse to talking about them.
Okay. You're actively against it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So moving forward then. So again, next part of the core book, and again, core part of any game is about action resolution. So when I first read this, so there's not a lot of difference, if any, I don't think, between 1E and 2E. Essentially, you're building a dice pool. So you've got kind of how many points you've got in this skill. You'll have a certain number of D6 that you'll what you call success dice. And then you also roll a feat dice. So it's a 12-sided dice. And really what you're looking for, you're rolling against a target number. And so you think to yourself, oh, no, I've got to work out what my target number is. Have I succeeded? And also, if you roll sixes. So again, I think this is where this isn't a free league only way of doing it, but it fits with the way free league make their systems work. The more sixes you roll, the better success you get. Okay. So it sounds really complicated. I think when I first brought it to the table, I thought, I'm never going to work this out. In reality, it's really simple because you just go, you look at it and go, that looks like it's greater than a particular number, and I've got a couple of sixes in there. So actually, resolution, I find, is really simple. And again, if you're playing on Foundry, obviously it does it all for you. So there you go. I don't know if you guys got any reflections on that score as action resolution.
Yeah. I think there's more to it though than, because the feat die also, you've got Gandalf and Eye of Sauron, which have particular effects. A Gandalf rune is I think that's is that the 12? It's what would be the number 12 is the Gandalf rune. And that means that you get an automatic success. So even if you don't necessarily, it's like you add up all the dice, they don't meet the target number, you're still successful. And Eye of Sauron counts as 0, even though it's the number 11 on the dice. And when you're miserable, it's an automatic failure. But also you've got things like in combat, it's certain higher numbers. I think it's a 10 plus, gives you a penetrating wound. So the action resolution you're right, it's simple. It's just rolling those dice. But you get a lot from that one roll. You're looking at I think the feat die is really significant. Quite swingy in a way. You've obviously got those. Like if you're rolling 3 success dice, it's easy you might feel that you've got a reasonable chance of doing something. I think if you've got 2 or less, it feels a lot riskier. And then obviously the feat die I don't know. And of course it can be ill-favoured or just like advantage and disadvantage. And
I was just about to say, it's amazingly simple.
Why, Steve? Why start now?
Well, you're right. There's a lot you can add to it. In fact, there is added to it by the game itself to make that relatively simple mechanic make a lot of things happen in the game. Paul, you got your hand up there?
Yeah, I just want to say it's simple enough to, I think, in play. It's slightly more complex to explain. But the other point I want to make is, again, we're talking about immersion in the world, Middle-earth, and that start there, even with the basic dice mechanic. With the D12, the feat dice, 2 of the faces being the Eye of Sauron, where essentially bad stuff happens. Even when you're counting a 0 on the dice roll, bad stuff often happens. And again, the Gandalf rune, sometimes it's good stuff happening there. And even if not, it's an automatic success. But that's already there in the basic dice mechanism. Starts off with that procedure of versus you in the game world.
And the 6s on the success dice are Tenguars. So again, that it's got little sticks on there as well, but that's the sort of thing that you make. Again, as you say, you're right, Paul, it immerses you. Dave?
Well, I was going to say actually, less about the sort of the mechanics of the dice themselves. I think when I've played it, it's more about what action I'm taking and how it works in terms of the sort of role-playing bit. I get that there's big swings and there can be big variances in success and failure. However, I think that sort of adds to the idea of, okay, think about what action you're taking first, how you can make that sort of fit within the narrative, and then let's see if it's successful. So particularly, that's why I play an elf in the game, and I'm trying always to think about, okay, what would be the action that an elf lord, if you like, would take, and then you make the roll afterwards. And then I think there's a little bit which we've not really talked about, which is about how you engineer a character and whether or not you try and. I think it takes min-maxing out of it. I think it's very difficult to be a min player within the One Ring. And I think part of that is influenced by the mechanics. I think part of it is influenced by this sort of immersion in the system. So that was really what I was going to say.
That's cool. I think it's like any game though, isn't it? It's how much you want between the sort of the mechanism of the game in terms of, again, there are rules there and you're trying to achieve something, but also how much role playing. I'm not sure. I don't think the One Ring has got a monopoly on it, but I think if you're immersed in the world, then that's the sort of thing that will probably more likely to come to the forefront.
But the heroic failure, though, can then add to that narrative. Yeah. And I think that's the bit that's important. The successful failure at the roll simply adds to the narrative. It's not, oh no, I'm going to die now. That's it. Everything's at an end. I think it works. I think it works really well.
Yeah, absolutely. Any thoughts from anyone else, Martin?
This goes for the year of Zero Edge generally, but I like rolling lots of dice, and there's atavistic pleasure there that I think that is part of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Rick?
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things. I think Neil's talked about how swingy it is. And as a result of that, but I think that's essential if you're going to do Tolkien, because there's always hope, not in a mechanical sense, but there's always a possibility. Even if you've got nothing, you can still roll a Gandalf, then you will succeed. So I think it is really swingy, but that's really appropriate. I think first edition, when the news of the second edition came out, the main thing that I think most of us thought was, please let them actually put in a proper editor this time. Someone with not necessarily a scalpel, an axe with a glint in their eyes. Someone to just hack it about and put things in the right place so you can understand it. Look at the second edition. That hasn't happened because I think it's really difficult, because there's so many different things that the dice have to do relating to so many things that I think we've moaned about the way it's laid out, but I think there's inherent problems in all the different things it does. And the other thing I would say, I've got set of first edition dice, physical dice. They are the prettiest ones I own.
That's
they look absolutely gorgeous. Not so keen on the second edition. First ones are.
They're great, aren't they?
Suits you.
Yeah. When they were clearing out Cubicle 7, we're getting rid of their back. Like I did buy an extra couple of sets of these. That's just because they were.
I think I've got about 7 sets.
We're amongst friends here. Don't you worry. But no, I think you're right, Rick. And I think that's one of the things I was going to say, that with this action resolution, this sort of section right at the start, yes, it sets out the basics, but it's spread out all over the book in terms of where different mechanics and how they work, etc. And I think it would benefit from we're not there yet. They're still putting the stuff out now, but certainly I have to make a ready reference sheet just to bring all the bits of the different parts of the book into one place, because it's a simple game at heart, like a lot of these games, but there's a lot of complexity, a lot of different moving parts within that.
Sorry, Steve, just to cut, I think absolutely true. I think especially when you're trying to run it and you look at somewhere and it says there's a skill description on one page, but how the skill works, see page 140.
Yeah.
And the index is, as I put in my notes here, effing useless. You cannot find stuff quickly in that book. And so when you are running it and one of your players says, what about that? And I go, why don't we just have a cup of tea and I'll try and find out.
Sort it out.
Because you just can't, it's just not easy. Even with the GM screen open in front of me.
Yeah.
There's just no way.
Yeah.
So that is a frustration of the edition.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I run from my reference sheets that I made myself so much that stopped figuring. But yes, I did sit down poring over the book and note.
And there's things that we've been playing. I think this is the game I'll probably run more of, even taking account of the RuneQuest campaign. I'd run more of this than anything else. And I'll read things and go, I didn't realize it worked like that. So for example, things like magical successes, the way it's written, you succeed and it's all magical. But actually, then there's another part of the book where it tells us about how that actually works. All it means is it's as if you rolled a Gandalf. That's it. Anyway, it's a challenge. It's fair to say. I think it's a worthy challenge. It's worth getting to grips with it. But I think anyone approaching this book for the first time, certainly I haven't played through the start set, but we can talk about the start set later. But I think it probably does a better job of this in terms of laying out the rules. But anyway, okay. All right. Anything else on action resolution? I'm just going to move forward because we've got a lot to get through.
On.
Okay. All right.
And also at the time of Tengwar runes, you can give your successes, if you've got those 6s, to other players. And that's building into that sort of fellowship type element of this.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually surprisingly important in some of the more detailed resolutions. It builds that sense of camaraderie coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does talk about in that, I don't know if it's in that section actually. And this is the problem. Is it in the action resolution section or somewhere else where it actually says what you can spend those 6s on? Read those extra successes. It could be anything really, as you say, give them to the people. But also or the player heroes. You can also do things like reduce the amount of time it takes to do something or get more information. And again, that's very year zero engine-y, isn't it? So you can use extra success to do different stuff. But I think it's more like it's convergent evolution rather than anything else in terms of the game. Yeah. But no, yes, you're right. Okay. All right. So moving on Dave, as you say, obviously to play any of these games, you need to have an adventurer. a player hero is in this. I think Ricky, you made a point about in 1E, there was quite you say, so in terms of starting cultures, you had a point to make about that.
Yeah, I think the thing with the 1E, you've got a bigger range of cultures because you've got things, you've got Bjornings, you've got Woodman, you've got, I think, Men of Minas Tirith, I think that comes in as well.
Yeah, that's coming. I think, as Paul said, there's a lot of supplements that were brought out for 1E, which they haven't gone over in 2E yet. So, yeah, I think that there was a broader range, certainly, of starting cultures if you take in the round.
But there is peoples of wilderness, I think it is, Wilderland, which is an official supplement by Free League. But there are, and I think that has 3 new cultures, 3 or 4 new cultures, but there's also, I think it's worth mentioning that there's a ton of like fan stuff. So if you go, somebody called Stakel of Noms, I think it is.
Yeah, that's the guy.
Who does like loads of 2E conversions of 1E stuff. So you can actually find all of those 1E cultures in 2E versions. They're not all official, I guess. It's maybe a different, but they are there. Sure.
Yeah, as you said, there's a ton of fan-made stuff, and in fact, there are. And I'm not sure how I feel about this, but there's ones for playing evil characters as well. So you could play, which I know that was something you could do in Merc. You could have your party of orcs and trolls laying waste to the Shire, because why wouldn't you? But yeah, that's something that I think is, certainly there's an appetite to do that. But again, I'm not sure. I don't think I really want to do that with the One Ring. It's about hope. It's about fellowship.
It's not
about
now.
What say, Paul?
It's not what the game's about, and I think that's not nice. That it's a game that knows what it's about.
Yeah, yeah. So let's say you got a good range of starting cultures. It's certainly in 2E. As I said, I made reference to before. It's not a game where you get lots of gear. Basically, you have each of your player heroes has a treasure score depending on their starting culture. So you have, I think the Dunedain they're frugal, or they basically start with very little. And through the game, you can, although not in my games, you can acquire treasure.
Big nosed at Steve.
And the more treasure you get, the more you can have access to like better armor. You don't buy it; it just becomes available to. And also, we'll talk about in the travel phase, you get access to better mounts and that sort of thing. Complaint. The only observation I'd have about certainly the starting characters is, unless everyone has a different culture, okay, within cultures they tend to be quite similar. And I think because I don't know how balanced the starting characters are, but they tend to be pretty vanilla. There's not a lot of difference, in my opinion. I don't know what you guys think about that, or whether that may not be even an issue.
I think it fits though with the way that Tolkien's constructed the world, isn't it? Most dwarves are of a type. Most men are of a type. They're either evil or they're good. So I'm not sure he was particularly complex about the way that he structured each of the races. I mean, you go more into the world and you go Silmarillion and everything else, then it becomes a little bit more differentiated, and then you get longer spans of people and types of cultures. Again, I think there's enough there to make a decent party with and have a bit of differentiation. So
I think every player has got a different character as well, from a different culture. Then it's built in. But I think if you want to have multiple hobbits, for example, I don't know. Yeah. Martin, you got your hand up?
Yeah, I'll pick you up on that, Steve, about multiple hobbits. So I ran the starter set adventures, which are all hobbits in Hobbitland environs. And so all my starting characters were hobbits. And yes, they are like what they're good at without even looking at their character sheets, because they're basically all the same. There's a bit of fine tuning on what skills they choose to be favored and things like that. But essentially, within sort of culture, they are very similar. There's not much to distinguish them. That said, once the adventure gets going and they have a chance to have some fellowship phases and choose how they advance, then the differences do arise. But I think if you think that the One Ring second edition is going to be for people who maybe are not steeped, as Dave says, are not steeped in the Lost Tales and Silmarillion, then I think the IP does a lot of heavy lifting in terms of differing cultures, because we know what, as Dave says, we know what an elf's like, because we've seen, what's his name, Hugo Weaving as Elrond, or you've seen Aragorn the Ranger, and so on. So I think the IP does quite a lot of heavy lifting for the TOE, TOR second edition, right? And that does really help for, I would say, for beginning players who are starting to explore the One Ring based on the films rather than Volume 8 of this History of Middle Earth.
Which we're all avidly reading at this moment, aren't we?
I am actually, sadly, I am.
You got Christmas, didn't you?
Got
With the ring.
Christmas. Yes. I'm so sorry. But yeah, so I think it does a really nice job of building into that as a kind of way of differentiating your characters.
Yeah. Neil?
Yeah, I was pretty much going to say some of what Mark was going to say there, but I do think there are, if you can think about these cultures, they're kind of like classes really. And they give you some of those choices are around attributes. So you can have different attributes which determine your target numbers for different skills. So that can make a difference. You don't have the same cultural blessing. So every hobbit, every ranger, every dwarf, and so on has the same cultural blessing. And then you do get some choices around some skills. Actually, some of that comes in through callings as well. The callings can also differentiate one halfling from another or one dwarf from another. So I think there's enough difference there to make a two halflings different, two elves different, two humans different. I've never really felt it's a problem that these characters.
No.
There's days that they do feel very Tolkien. They are in a mold, but within that mold, there's lots of bits that you can change and tweak to make them individual. And of course, picking names is very important, as we found out with Groin and
Groin.
Groin changed his name.
Right. Don't name shame him. He was Groin and he was proud.
It's growing. Yeah, dear.
Anyway, all right.
That's all I've got to say.
Just before I come to you a bit, Paul. So I think it's not a problem. I think it's just an observation that some might come into it. And I think, again, that's a function of there's only 3 stats, isn't there? So there's strength, heart, and wits. Is it will? There you go.
Is it wits?
Whatever.
Wits.
Anyway, third one. And then you've got a relatively small number of skills, which is in my mind is a good thing, because it just means that skills bloat is horrible. Looking at you, RuneQuest. But I think what that means is there's a chance of actually the parameters are relatively limited, so there could be some similarity. But as you say, as you move forward, then you've got an experience, then you get the differentiation. Sorry, Paul.
Yeah, I was just saying, I agree with your observation that people from different cultures are pretty similar there, with just a little bit of that, at least as starting characters. I think I'll say it's again a feature of maybe in the core book having a fairly limited number of cultures. But of course, men from Bree and Dunedain, for example, are very different. So it's not quite species based.
Yeah.
Or again, elves of Linden and elves of Rivendell are again pretty different. So there are some subtleties there, but again, it's culture based. I think it's Neil's point, it's culture as classes.
Yeah. And they're bringing out obviously supplements which sort of build on that. So the most recent one, which I haven't looked at yet, horrifyingly, I haven't pre-ordered it yet. The elf book, whatever it's called, is going to have a lot more detail around high elves in there. So again, there's that differentiation will come. But yeah, I think it's been drip fed, and as I say, it's not an issue. I think it's just an observation, really. Okay, all right. Moving forward, then. Next up, we've got characteristics, which sort of talk about skills. It talks about attributes like endurance and hope, and all these. Endurance is the amount of hit points, if you like, and hope is a key mechanic in the game, absolutely critical. But let's just talk about skills a little bit first. Again, this is carried over from 1E, is relatively limited skill set. And again, I think it is that convergent evolution with the Year Zero engine, relatively small number of skills. What do we think? Enough? Too much? Could do with more? What do you think?
Yes, all right.
I think the only issue with the number of skills that there are is that I think you tend to end up using the same skills a lot for lots of different things, for lots of tasks. However, again, I think it fits in that sort of really quite broad brush approach to the books, really. If you're good at surviving in the wilderness, like Boromir, for example, you don't need an awful lot more than sort of survival or endurance. It can be applied in a number of different ways. And I think that's probably part of the strength of the game, is that you do try and find different ways of using those skills. Are there enough? Merc clearly had 30 odd, and that's not enough. Clearly. And you need a quick table for every single one of them. But I think the skill system works with the whole emphasis of the game, which is about fellowship and party and adventuring, rather than necessarily skill tests, combat, and everything else.
I think let's come to you in a second, Neil, but I think what I'd say is that I think it doesn't matter how many skills you've got in a sort of your portfolio as in a game, characters will only ever be pretty good at a few of them. And so inevitably the characters or the players will get their character to say, I would like to orate in this situation, looking at Terrastor from RuneQuest, because that was one of his key skills. Players will always play to their strengths. So it doesn't matter I think that inevitably you end up with a constrained set. And I think the other observation is that although there's a lot of mechanics in the game, the One Ring is not a granular game, really. So we'll talk more about it when we get to things like combat and stuff. It is meant to be on that sort of balance between narrative and, I don't know, what are the words? What's the other word? What do they call about RuneQuest? They say it's
simulation.
That's the one. The One Ring is definitely not that. Okay. I think it's enough to give you a breadth of things to do, but again, it's not trying to be everything. Neil, you got a hand up?
Yeah. There's 18 skills. I think that is a perfect number. I'm not a fan of games that have tons of skills because I just think I don't know. I could do without skills, to be honest, in a lot of games as well. But I just think for all those reasons, players lean into the skills that they're good at and they try and justify a way of using them. So I think the 18 we got here are perfect. But also, these skills are in categories. If you look on page 61 of the rules, you got strength, heart, and wit, and then your first skill in strength, in heart, and in wit are all personality skills. So when you approach situations, your target numbers are going to be different for strength skill, a heart skill, and a wit skill. So you really want to try and use your best target number. And then so you might go, I will use awe, for example. Awe's generally a bit like, if it goes wrong, it could be perceived as threatening and so on. So, whereas that's very different to persuading somebody through logic and emotion and so on. And I think when you apply the right skill, it adds something to the narrative, really, in terms of how that scene plays out. And if you use the same skill multiple times for slightly different things, I don't see that as a problem at all. In a sense, you can succeed or you fail, and each has different interests and outcomes. Keep it simple and just go with it and try and get that flavour out of it as well.
I think because the game allows for there's always a chance of success, even if you've got a feat die. So we always had situations where one of our other players, Tony, was coming up with this lovely oration of this is how he's going to do this thing. And I'd say, I think that sounds like a persuade roll. They go, I'm not very good at that. We all do it, don't we?
Yeah.
But there's always a chance. One of those face on a D12, you got a chance. Okay. Martin.
Yeah, just a couple of things that I've been thinking about. What are the point of attributes? Because all they do is set the target number.
Yes.
They have no other mechanical function, as far as I know.
That's a pretty big mechanic. Your target number is pretty key.
Yeah,
though,
but what I don't mean is you never then use you don't use your strength as an attribute, do you? You use it as an adjunct to a skill. You may as well just pick target numbers, like in the little table where you work out. I don't know why we have to go through the attribute thing.
It's simple. I think it's nice and simple.
I guess so. And I know, and I do know that. And one thing you said, Neil, made me rethink slightly in that it does sort them out into kind of skill categories, which I think
it's overt about that in the game as well. It talks about this.
Yeah,
broken down the character sheet makes that clear as well.
Because I did wonder, because obviously you have that thing where a player asks to do something and you think, I got no idea what that is. And like in another game, you just go, fine, roll your intelligence.
Yeah.
But that option isn't open to you as obviously as it is in other games. So that's one thing maybe.
Yeah.
And like riddle gets on my nerves because it seems to be used by, if you read the written scenarios as written, riddle is used for bloody everything. Are you trying to confuse somebody? Are you trying to hide something? Are you trying?
Yeah. Yes.
It is super, super broad.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure some of the advice of how to use the skills when you're writing as a lore master, whatever it's called, lore master, isn't it? But I think if you're try to write your own homebrew stuff, the guidance on using skills is a little less clear, I'd say.
Yeah, I always get confused by Riddle. Riddle is one that you think, because it's a bit like being a bit sneaky as well.
It's kind of like, it's a little bit catch-all.
Yeah.
And finally, of course, I just want to point out that the new battle skill effing sucks. And I rest my case.
Because your characters always use that, don't they?
Yeah, because it used to be bloody brilliant.
Yeah.
And they've completely defanged it.
But I would refer you to the fact I was reading this again, Rally Comrades does what you used to think Battle used to do now. And anyway, we'll come back to that in the combat section, but that gives bonus dice to everybody, including yourself.
We have to be in forward stance, though, I think, don't you?
Yeah, so there's
only a fool does that.
Defensive stance all the way. Yeah. Paul, Rick, any thoughts about? We'll talk about hope in a second, but anything about skills before we move on to that one?
I think the other thing I'll say about skills is it does feed in, because of course we've got these almost sort of subsystems for different things like travel and combat and interactions. And there's a sub-selection of maybe 4 or 5 of each skills for each of those activities.
Yeah.
Quite nice.
Yeah.
It's a well-chosen set.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think, again, this is just like picking hairs, splitting hairs, picking whatever, doing something unmentionable.
Your nose.
I know
picking our noses. Because I think in play it works well. I think there is a few like weird little things on the edge, but generally it's got, again, I don't like loads of skills because it just gets confusing.
I think it's also worth mentioning that skills are on a range of 1 to 5, which represents the number of success dice. You roll the number of D6 you roll.
Yeah.
So if your skill is a 3 and you roll 3 of them, 3 D6s and 1 sheet dice, which is the higher the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's simple, isn't it? Yeah, all good. Let's talk a little about hope, because that is Lord of the Rings. The Tolkien's world is about nothing if not about hope and fellowship. And this mechanic for me it works incredibly well. So each character will have a resource of hope, a certain number of points. And also there's the fellowship, the group of player heroes, they will have a pool of fellowship points to draw on as well, which can be used to turn into additional hope points as well. And it's the constant tension, because you can use hope to, if you spend hope on yourself, on your character, you get to get an extra dice, a bonus dice to your roll. It also links in, so we talked about characters. One of the things that can differentiate a little bit is what they call distinctive features. So these are things, a little like tweaks on your character. So for example, it might be that your character is bold or wary or whatever it might be. And if you spend a hope point and it links it with your distinctive features, that's a constant interaction with the GM. Does this count? And I go, no, generally it doesn't anyway. But if it does link up, then you get an extra bonus dice as well. So and also if your fellow heroes can support you by spending hope as well. So you've got this constant interplay. And then the downside, I think, is that if your hope goes below your shadow points in 1E, I don't think shadow is so much of an issue. I don't think. It's certainly much more of an issue in 2E, or maybe that's just the way the scenarios we've been running. But if your hope gain more shadow than you've got hope, then you become miserable, and that's got impacts on the game as well. You're more likely to fail rolls. Over to you guys. What do you think about hope? Are you for it? Do you like hope? All about hope?
Absolutely.
I'd like to have some. Yeah.
I think one thing that was noticeable, Artie, rest in peace, this was Tony's character, man of brig, huge amounts of hope, merrily bowling along, doing all kinds of stuff. Whereas for the rest of us, particularly thinking higher men, so Martin's character of 9, almost nothing. It's so constricting if you haven't got very much hope. I mean, I think maybe its significance is a bit too high in the game. I don't know. Everything seems to run off it, which means you have to be quite careful with the managing of it. But you can't really argue with it. It's such a perfect thing for the setting and the context and Tolkien's writing to have hope as the in-game currency. I think it's just a wonderful mechanic. It's really good. I'm just a bit, I don't know. I'd like to have some. I think I agree with that idea.
Dave?
I was just going to say, considering, and as Rick absolutely says, it's such a fundamental part of the game. Considering it is important and affects so many areas, it's brought down to 2 pages in the rulebook, and but it has an impact on just about every single piece. You can become miserable, which affects your hope. You can become injured, which affects your hope. You can spend too much hope. You can spend too little hope. If you have part of the fellowship of the group, you have a sponsor who can add hope, who can alter dice simply by his influence. It's a huge impact on the game, but they've given it 2 pages. I think that maybe that's the bit where you end up. It's not quite as basic as spending luck in Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah.
And it's not as easy to get as it would be in, I'm trying to think of another game that has a similar mechanic, but it's so fundamental, but it's just 2 pages.
Yeah.
When you get there, when you're operating as a group and you have to marshal that as a resource, I think you become almost obsessed by how much hope have I got?
Yeah.
Am I sad to have too much shadow? And
Yeah.
it's funny. I think actually it's the one element of the game that goes across almost every single section of play.
It does.
It's not
you can spend
really
hope on
given-
any roll. Even on, I think, Valor and Wisdom rolls. I think you can spend hope on that as well. An armor roll. I think it's pretty much everything. You're right. It's quite hard to get. So you can get some hope back in the fellowship phases. So if you've got quite an extended adventuring phase, then obviously that could be an issue. I think where that little sort of pool that can replenish it is where you get, so at the start of every session, your fellowship points refresh. And if you're the player heroes have an opportunity to sit down, share some lembas and a drink of ale or whatever, they can share some hope out. They can turn those fellowship points to hope. But then it's quite a nice narrative thing as much as we've opportunity to rebuild our fellowship. But it's a finite resource, and we'll talk more about shadow points in a second. But yeah, Martin?
Yeah, just to pretty much agree. But I think when you were talking earlier about how games and treasure, so in some ways, regaining hope is like treasure because it's more valuable to you than gold.
Yeah.
And I know scenarios as written, there's little things that can happen that will give you a point of hope. So you will meet somebody on the road who will give you, it doesn't happen in your game, Steve, obviously, but in games where
No hope.
where there is no hope. But in scenarios as written, it sees if you can get like a little crumb of hope from meeting a kind stranger. And I think that A is just like the setting completely, absolutely brilliant. And B, I think it's a nice substitute for your gold coins.
Yeah. It is there. I think there's a journey event as well. They can give you hope, but you get to your point, Steve, around tension and the tension it creates. I think that's what really drives it, because you are making decisions around when to spend hope. That is a real temptation when you're in a situation that you feel is quite desperate, that you start chucking all your hope in and then scupper them so you don't really have anywhere to go, or you get super cautious about spending hope. So it's a clever little device that, and because it is so scarce, you've got to be pretty cautious about how you use it. And I think sometimes we are probably a little like over eager. And then I think the very worst thing is when you spend a point of hope and you still fail. Is that then, that's just like it kicking the nuts that you just like, but yeah.
That's when your superpower patrons come in, isn't it? We'll talk about them later, because some of those are broken. Anyway, my opinion. Paul, any thoughts? Rick, any thoughts?
I'm just thinking that the hope and shadow sort of economy is the special sauce that makes that game all Middle-earthy and makes everything run round.
Yeah.
There's an element as well of using hope, or starting hope as balance between some hobbit or some sort of Dunedain or elf lord. And you can almost see, okay, that's why elf lords don't just do everything, right? They've got no hope left.
Yes. So when your characters are fresh and they're starting out and they've got hope and they've got no shadow and they're out in the world and they're doing all this stuff, But then as they become a little bit more sort of world weary and cynical, and once they've been to the Hill of Fear, frankly, they come back from the Hill of Fear, then they go.
Some of them come back.
Some of them come from the Hill of Fear,
Same.
or whatever. Yeah, and I think it's an interesting character arc because you say you developed, shadow points and shadow points. We'll talk more about the mechanic later, but it's so critical, and especially when you start to, you can turn some of those shadow points into shadow scars, which are permanent or very difficult to get rid of. That's when, you've got loads of hope and then you've got loads and then you suddenly haven't. And it's the point when you haven't got the hope that the things become more, let's say, challenging. Rick, your hand up.
Yeah, you mentioned the Hill of Fear. Gareth Ryder Hanrahan, you killed ours, and we do not forgive, we do not forget. That's the first thing. Second thing, we've talked about hope. I think you also need to talk about fatigue and traveling, because that is murder. I mean, I know we're going to talk about traveling later, but it's the fact that fatigue, if you haven't got any amount or anything like that, it takes days to recover from that. When you arrive at somewhere, let's get on with it. No, you can't. You're still trying to recover that. And that's nasty.
Yeah.
Agree with everything people have said about hope, but fatigue is a really nasty thing. And that's why travel can become so difficult. And he's someone whose character regularly coughed up every travel roll and made everyone knackered. Although I think Neil's character was having a kip in the bottom of the boat at the time that arrived fresh as a daisy, as I recall.
Yes, indeed. I think the thing about, we'll talk more about travel. I don't know whether we'll get to it today because we've been talking for an hour. We're only a few chapters in. So this may be one we can come back to and do a multiple parts podcast on. But endurance, say it's hit points, basically. And the stuff you carry around with you, that increases your load. So if the weight of your encumbrance, if that exceeds your endurance, so through damage or whatever it might be, and fatigue, so travel fatigue adds to your load as well, you become weary. And that has got a major impact. So on the success dice, if you physically see them, the 1 to 3 is just an outline and the 4 to 6 is in solid colours. When you're weary, that 1 to 3, they don't count. So you could roll you could roll up to 3 on 5 dice and it's a 0. It doesn't sound like much, but it can be a massive problem, There are mechanics that help you get around that. But I think that's one of the things that certainly when you start playing, that fatigue, load, endurance, how does that all interact? How does that work? If you're playing on Foundry or a VTT, they'll often tell you what that impact is. But I think in a face-to-face game, unless you're across that, it'd be easy to miss that because it is a bit of a nuance that you need to get your head around. All right. Okay. So characteristics. And this is, again, you could argue this probably should be part of the characteristics chapter, but the next chapter of the book is Valor and Wisdom. Okay. And in this, you've got, what is in this chapter? There's a lot in this chapter. Valor and Wisdom.
It's the kind of rewards and virtues.
Yeah. Okay.
Resting, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, so as I say, valor is valor is valor, strange enough. But in the game, it ties into getting hold of certain rewards. So rewards are physical items that you get, like magic swords or whatever. When you start as a starting character, it's very limited what you can. You only end up, I think it's up with 1 point in each, or in 1 point in either, isn't it? Wisdom or valor. And there's a limited set of rewards you can get, and also tied to your wisdom, there are your virtues, which is the things that ways it's almost like feats, if you like, things you're able to do within the world. And then you've got, again, it starts to differentiate more between the different cultures. You've got cultural virtues. So again, at the starting gates, characters very similar, but this is the point at which you can start to really differentiate, really. Valor and wisdom are really important for that, but also they link to being able to resist the effect of the shadow. Okay. So if you've got dread, that means you need to start rolling valor, okay, to try and resist that dread. And if you've got the shadow test require wisdom as well. So it's not a thing you can just go, I'm not bothered about that, because it's really important in the game, because again, it plays into that whole hope economy. Okay, over to you guys. Any thoughts, valor, wisdom, reflections? Does it work? Martin, straight out the gates.
Yeah, I have a bugbear about valor. I know I've mentioned this before, but I haven't really done anything with it. But I think wisdom's brilliant. And the access to those virtues, and the virtues are really solid, interesting, narrative and kind of mechanical, interesting developments of your character. But valor is boring. Valor, you get, slightly sharper sword, slightly pointier spear.
Yes.
And it's a really limited range of what you can do with that. And that's really disappointing, I think. And what I think makes it a bit more disappointing is there's nothing in the rules to say, why not develop your own rewards?
Yeah.
And give you some guidance as to how to do that. I know I fiddled about with having maybe the Horn of Boromir.
Yeah.
And it gives you, instead of making it grievous, it gives you +1 to your valor roll, or your rally comrades, for example. And it just seems very restrictive. It's weirdly restrictive given how open a lot of the rest of the game is.
Yeah.
It seems a weirdly restrictive kind of limit on it. And so that's a frustration.
I get you. Paul?
I agree actually fully that the rewards are pretty, there's a lack of flavour in them.
Yeah.
I think a bit in first edition, there were cultural rewards, which were nice and flavoursome, albeit occasionally forced. And second edition doesn't have that. It's actually quite, like you say, like I said, it's actually quite dull. One thing it does lift up is later in the game, if you get a magic item with several properties, and increasing your valor starts to unlock properties, then it gets a bit more interesting again.
Yeah. But I hate the way magic items are done in this. It's just really odd and confusing, and it doesn't make sense. But I suppose just to your point, Martin, about it's not a gear game, and Valor is inherently, the way it's currently set out, it's tied to stuff, things, shields, armor, helmet, swords, whatever. And I'll let you come back. And in the source material, there's might have something that's a slightly sharper sword. So it probably is true to the source material, but in play, it's not very interesting. But there you go. Go on, Martin. I can see you be in your bonnet.
I don't think that's right, Steve. I think Tolkien was a bit of a gearhead because there's named weapons of renown. They're littered about. Okay. The File of Galadriel. It's just something like Lembas. There's a lot of gear in Lord of the Rings that doesn't make it into the One Ring second edition, which I think Valor Rewards would be an ideal vehicle for that. But it seems to have stalled a bit on that bit.
It's a really good point. So you could see having maybe Lembas as a virtue, a Valor. How does that link to Valor? Anyway, I don't know. That's the sort of thing. So I'm thinking about Grimval. So Neil's character's got Nelly. So then your cultural virtue is a Hound of Mirkwood, which is, it's a creature. It's not real, but it's a thing. It's a physical object. That might come in Valor, but it's almost seems, it's not fully realised, I don't think, maybe. I've never really reflected on that in the past. Rick?
I need a wee. I'll be back shortly.
Excellent.
Keep it in, Steve. Keep it in.
That's going to go at the start. Dave, you can't have a wee.
I need some sleep now.
Okay.
My endurance is... the point I was going to make about wisdom and valor kind of impinges on what Martin was saying, in that it's not really the things that you don't influence your development. So if you had a particularly, wise encounter, Artie was a really good case in point. He did so many things that influenced groups of people. You could then see maybe wisdom should have been developed for him to be able to influence groups of people. And I think that's the bit where they haven't taken this far enough. And the valorous aspects, being able to inspire the rest of your group, because in the past you have done things that are Tolkien-esque. Absolutely. I'm trying to think of particularly good examples, but maybe Gandalf going into the Mordor and trying to fight Gollum. Now, it should be an inspirational thing. He is so brave, and you could take heart from it. And I think that's a bit where they probably missed with this wisdom and valor, it being able to influence the wider group as a sort of a development, almost as a group development tool. So I think that's a shame.
So in 1E, if I recall correctly, there was a mechanism whereby the things you did, you had to use the skills, and I think valor and wisdom as well, potentially. Or Paul might correct me on that one.
I think what the two sets, you have the skills. Valor and wisdom and combat skills are separate. So you had the XP tracks, didn't you? One for valor and wisdom and one for the skills.
And you've got that now, so you've got adventure points and skill points. But I think in 1E, there was a mechanism whereby you had to use the skill to be able to improve it. So it's a bit like a sort of...
That's the only way they improve, wasn't it? The other, other one.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So they sort of simplified it in this one, which I think, to your point, Dave, I think it does make it so that you go, oh, I'm just going to put my valor up by 1 or whatever. It's not really, it's not so well tied. But again, I suppose it's how much bookkeeping you want to do. It's probably easier on I think it would be feasible to put that in, but yeah. Okay.
I don't miss the skills bookkeeping from 1E, I must admit.
You don't miss it. If it was on a VTT, in the ideal world, it would just automate it for you. So you've succeeded. You can increase your skills, but yeah. Okay, all right. Anything on I quite like the cultural virtues. Reading through those, they are pretty flavoursome. I think Nellie, as the head of Mirkwood, has developed a life or a character of her own, including seeing off certain non-player characters that had irked the party for a little while. Gary, rest in peace. Rest in pieces, as Nellie got hold of him. I'm not sure how Tolkien-esque that was, but it was very gratifying. There you go.
Loved it.
Okay, all right. We're about halfway through the book. We haven't got into adventuring phase, fellowship phase, etc. Do you want to park it there and we can come back together at some point? All right. So was there anything anyone wanted to pick up on about some of the things we spoke about last time that sort of bursts of insight that you wanted to share?
It's no MERP, is it? Let's be honest. It's no.
I mean, yes, it is definitely not MERP.
And that is a strong point.
That is, yes. Needs to be made.
But then what is other than MERP?
Against the Dark Master is MERP, isn't it?
That's true.
Ale Shadow.
I've got zones, for God's sake. Against the Dark Master's got zones in it. What's that nonsense? And there's no static maneuver rolls. Come on.
Storygate.
What the F is a bloody static maneuver anyway? Come on.
I think I'm doing one right now, Steve.
It's the opposite of a dynamic maneuver, surely.
No, it's a moving maneuver and a static maneuver. I think it's like picking lock and shit. Anyway, we covered the first 5 chapters last time. And so the next, chapter 6, adventuring phases. And the first bit in this is combat. So this is where all the dice mechanic comes into play. One of the things I really like about it is the fact that, as I think was mentioned before, on the feat dice, so you roll your normal feat dice plus success dice. If your feat dice is typically 10 or more, that is a wound straight off. So although your characters have got endurance, hit points, basically, what's wrong with the hit points, you've also got the chance of getting really hammered early in a fight with an unfortunate roll on the feat dice. So I really like it from that perspective. There's always a risk element to it. So I suppose over to you guys, really. Thoughts about combat in the One Ring second edition? Any differences with 1E? Not that I can remember much about 1E, to be honest.
Maybe is it a bit pacier than 1E? Well, I think it's great. I think it's quite deadly, which I do quite like. It can be tactical. It's some nice decision making you've got to do. And I think that balances nicely with the swinginess of the dice that we talked about before. You might be lucky and get a Gandalf rune and do a, what's the name? What do you call it? Penetrating, whatever it is.
Force the foe to make armor roll at that point.
That's conversely, you might have a great whacking load of dice and it just doesn't go your way. I quite like that. Also, I think it also allows for quite heroic moments as well. You get great success and a Gandalf rune and you do loads of damage and you batter these things down. I think it's, I like it.
Yeah, I think it's the fact that there are few choices at each level means it's quite quick. But I think you do need to think about what you're doing. So the best example I can think of is when we were ambushed in the tunnels by a larger force. And clearly the mistake was a forward stance when you're outnumbered and then getting absolutely bashed all over the place. But it tends to be quite quick. It does make you think a little bit about, am I being aggressive or am I being defensive? And what the situation is. So taking note of the situation and your skills, I think, is a good way of interpreting that sort of attitude towards combat. Yeah, I rather like it. It's simple. I think, but it's a little bit more complicated than roll to hit. You've got to think about it a little bit more.
Yeah, I think, as you say, there are various stances. So, as you say, forward stance, open stance, defensive stance, or rearwards. So, rearwards when you've got Nicholas shooting his bow from the outskirts. Doesn't tend to happen that often, really, in my experience. But certainly the stances, and obviously the more aggressive you are, the easier it is to hit the foe, but also the easier it is to hit you. So, yeah, as you say, it's a bit of an issue. Also, there's decisions to make, but the system itself is quite abstract. In fact, it's very abstract. So you select your stances, all the good guys go before the enemies, but actually there's no maps involved. Not certainly as it in out of the box. So there's no sort of terrain maps and that sort of thing. So there's decisions, but there's no, as it out of the box, there's no actual tactical movement, is there, within that?
Yes. Yeah.
So I was just saying, I quite like that as a way of modelling it, where you have the sort of volley round and then close combat. And that sort of does model movement enough for me. And I agree with the speed. The other nice thing, again, as mentioned, is that it feels deadly. I'm not sure it is quite as deadly as it feels, but it does feel deadly, and that's important.
Yeah.
And then the stances give you a small decision to make each round, which means you're not just rolling to hit each round. You're not just doing the same thing each round. And that's quite important, that you're not doing exactly the same thing each round, I think, in a combat system for me.
And you have the options as well, don't you? Sorry, Dave. And so in terms of, so you select your stances, and each stance has a heroic action attached to it. For example, if you're in forward stance,
Intimidate foe is forward stance.
Intimidate foe, exactly. And each stance has got a particular action added to it. So yeah, I think you've got a lot of flexibility there. I did try, just because I like battle maps, to put in maps with zones. And so when we play face to face, I use some of the battle maps to show a bit of variety. And I've tried it on the VTT as well, but I think it's almost like I added that complexity in, and it didn't meet a need because no one ever used the map. They just hit stuff. So I think that's probably just me over complicating things as per bloody usual. So anyway.
I think the other thing is, and it comes, it fits in with what Paul was just saying. The feat dice give that added element of peril, don't they? It's that sort of, you see the Eye of Sauron, or you see the Gandalf, and there's either celebration or commiseration. But it's just that slight added complexity that's really good.
Cool. Rick, Neil, Martin?
It's interesting what you said about, I think you and Paul both touched on it, on archery, because it doesn't feel like, I think in other games you might choose to put whatever ability points or wherever you might have skill points, whatever, into archery, bow skill or whatever, and be quite able to contribute effectively to a combat the same as everybody else. And maybe you could do that here as well. You know, when you choose your characters, it's not kindred, is it? Your culture. Your culture, yeah. When you choose your culture, you get two weapons to choose from. One's normally like a melee weapon, the other one's a ranged weapon. I don't know if anybody ever goes for the ranged weapon, because there are some rules that restrict how effectively you can use it. You have to have a certain number of your party in close combat stance, so that could be open or forward or whatever. And I suppose it feels like it's not a general use combat skill. You have the volleys, around the two volleys before combat starts as everyone closes in. Beyond that, you want to put your bow away and go toe to toe with your sword or axe or whatever. At least that's how it feels to me. I don't know if I've ever known anybody to pick and play a character that is solely effective as a ranged combat.
I have, but there's pretty much, the rule is, like I said, there's got to be twice as many in close combat as distant combat. And if the enemy outnumber you 3-1 or more, that's out. You can't be at a distance. But I think there's a couple of enemies that can just leap and attack someone who's in the rearward stance. So what I find is there's usually, say as a group of 4 players, there's room for 1 archer. You can't get 2 archers in. There's not the scope for that. And even then, they are occasionally going to be forced to fight in close combat.
Yeah, I mean, there is another stance which is available in I think it's a Strider mode, which is like the single play mode, which is the skirmish stance, I seem to recall. And that does allow you to be a bit more in and out, use your bow, etc. Go on, Martin.
So the skirmish stance when I'm running it, I've got a couple of the hobbits do the skirmish stance, and it's not great. As the rule is, you have to take a -1 penalty for firing it while you're using the skirmish stance. So it is a little bit, go on, then we'll let you be an archer, but you're going to be rubbish at it. And I just agree with Neil that I don't think archery is properly balanced. But then in the texts, apart from Legolas, no one fires a bow really, and it's all knife work, as Legolas would say. So I think maybe it's a little bit like that. I'd agree with a lot of people what have already said. I think it's a lovely balance between tactics with your stance choice and hope spends and stuff like that, and great successes encourage a little bit of narration. What does that look like? How did you manage that? How have you heartened your fellows? The kind of in-combat maneuvers you can do. I like that as well. I think it can be deadly, and I suppose this is my slight criticism again, is that I think this goes against, throughout the book, rule book, you're referred to as kind of player heroes, and there's a big sort of thing about heroism. And I think then being shanked by like a cutthroat in the back streets of Bree doesn't necessarily tie with that. And
it's hard for that to happen, though, isn't it? Really, if you've got it can. Obviously, it can. There's a possibility.
We were ambushed by a bunch of cutthroats, Steve, and nearly all died.
Yeah.
There wasn't a Balrog in sight, and we nearly all perished by a wagon.
I think that was just because you were outnumbered, weren't you? And there were some unlucky rolls or lucky rolls for the cutthroats, let's say.
But again, it's not like heroes aren't outnumbered in the text. They're often sorely outnumbered.
But I guess, are we at the level of Aragorn and Boromir? And
we're no pushovers now, are we? We've got a fair whack of experience behind us, and we can still fall prey to kind of Billy Nettleface and these little guys.
Like, you could be dead in 4 bad rolls. So from your point of view, somebody gets a piercing blow and then you fail your armor check. That's 1 wound. And then same happens again, you're dead. So in 2 rounds, you could go, if you were very unlucky, you could go from being a full health, even full endurance. You wouldn't be a full endurance because you would take some endurance damage, but you could still be relatively effective. And then just like bish bosh, you're down.
It could even be in 3 rolls. So 1 piercing blow, 2nd failure armor roll, 3 roll for the severity of the wound, roll an eye, because you had a character that happened to, didn't Martin? And you're down. You're dying.
Did I, Steve? I forget.
Lost so many.
I think it's a case, though, again, of feeling deadly.
Yeah.
And again, looking at, say, Lord of the Rings, even, they're ambushed by orcs in Moria or something. They're worried.
Yes. Yeah, that's fair. And I'm going to argue against myself, of course, because even the mightiest man may be slain by 1 arrow.
Yeah.
And what's his name? What's his chops?
What, Boromir?
No, Isildur gets bumped off by somebody, doesn't he? A bit like a stray arrow. I guess. Yeah, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Tolkien is right.
Just depends how you're feeling that morning, and whatever the revision he wrote that day, it would depend on how deadly he is.
On that point about deadliness, how long have we been playing before we lost a character? For an awfully long time before we lost anybody, didn't we?
I think the first ones we lost were at it was one of the weekends, maybe a couple of
wasn't it Joe's?
22 maybe.
Yeah, it was 2 weekends.
Joe's character. Yeah. Joe's early on when we didn't realise going to a cave with 6 goblins might be a bit tricky. And so we realised it is. I think in all those years of playing, we possibly lost, 4, 5 characters, maybe. Something like that.
And if memory serves, that it went in pairs. We lost 2 at once.
Yes.
Yeah, sometimes rather than just individuals, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's all part of the fun, though, isn't it? I think.
The other interesting thing I think worth mentioning is that there is a little bit of a death spiral in as much as
when your endurance goes down below your load, the amount of gear you're carrying, you get knackered and you become weary. And I think you talked about it last time, Steve. So any 1 to 3 results on the success dice on the D6 is ignored. And that can be brutal. That can be, and that makes such a difference.
You can do things like you can throw your helm or your shield to one, which reduces your load. A great thing. You wouldn't want to do it, but you can make yourself so you're no longer weary. Again, some of the fellowship phase actions, you can have songs. So you can have battle songs. If you sing those, it means that you're no longer weary. What's more Tolkien than singing a song as you're getting hammered by a load of goblins?
There was a time when the battle roll really did even things up, I think.
You and your battle roll. It was broken. So I'm glad that when I wrote to them and said, this is broken.
Oh,
all right. Okay. So it sounds like we're in favour of the combat side of things. Any combat system is going to have issues.
I do have niggles.
Yeah. Okay. Go on then.
One niggle is some of the foes where Pal Shop it, you make it up, you get to them at 0 endurance, and usually your foes out at 0 endurance. I think there's one example where they make an armor save, and if they make it, they go up to maximum endurance again.
Yes. Yes. Hideous strength.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. I love that one. That was really good. And also, you've got... Go on.
I was just to say, and ones that have lots of hate, they're like bastards, those ones. He's just going to spend points of hate and he does 6 success dice more of damage or something like that.
I do like foes with hate. And if they have might as well, like they actually do too. For every point of might, you can do additional attacks. Sometimes I use the hate, but sometimes I forget about might as well. So sometimes they can be even tougher than some of the foes you've faced. So yeah. Any more niggles? Or
there's no critical tables, which is obviously
that'll be in the...
We'll live with it. Yeah,
we'll live with it. The only thing I was going to say before we move on to the next part of this chapter is about because we said before about rules are all over the shop in terms of they're in different parts of the book. So in this section, they talk about complications. So complications isn't just, it's like plus or minus 1 or 2 dice, basically. But it's like a bit of an afterthought. It's something that seems to be, they had it in playtest and they sometimes used it, but it doesn't really give you a lot of guidance as to how to use it. But it's there, and I used it a little bit when we had things like zones with uneven footing or whatever. But again, I think we just stopped using that because we just got so carried away with hitting stuff with swords that we forgot about it.
Although that is anything now the battle roll can actually do. I don't want to sound a broken record, but
trick tables from Dave, battle roll from you, hideous strength from Paul. All right, okay. Where's me next bit? Here we go. Spreads. All right, okay. So next bit then. So again, in chapter 6, this is the key part of the book. It is councils, which, to my mind, they're like extended tasks, really, or skill challenges or whatever you want to call it, that sort of thing. We'll put it this way: it fits really well with a clock. Okay, you can put a clock on it, so I'm happy. And also, it seems a little bit more coherent in terms of a mechanic than it was in 1E. So in 1E, councils were a bit, it's like, it didn't really match up very well, whereas this is more, what do the player heroes want to achieve? They want Lady Almarian Stock, who's a horrible old woman, to come and see this thing that's happening, and they have to try and convince her. So it's what's at stake for the NPC, that sort of governs how difficult it is, and then all the player heroes can contribute with various roles to try and get that certain number of successes within a certain number of attempts. So it's pretty straightforward. It works. I can understand it. So it's a relatively low bar on that one.
I think it's social combat, which isn't done well in a lot of games. I think it works pretty well. I think you're right about it being better than First D. I never fully played First D, but I've been doing quite a bit of conversion from First D to Second D because I'm running Bree and Environs with my home group. And when I was looking about converting councils, it was like, this makes no sense. And so the new system, I think, is seen a lot more streamlined and more, just easier to use, really.
It definitely makes a lot more sense than First D, even when you use council. So Second Edition, yes, a good thing. It's using it for basically social conflict, and that's what you want. First Edition, it's more like Elrond asks you to do a job, and great. And the first thing you do is you have a council with Elrond where you try and convince him you're capable of doing the job.
Just another step we just don't need.
That's
Isn't it, frankly?
it feels like a superfluous. Yeah.
That
It
sounds
is.
like a super.
We're doing it now. We're doing the job for Elrond, but he doesn't like us very much.
Council with Elrond, Council of Elrond, maybe talk about a played around with something like that. I think I do like it, but it feels, I don't know if we've ever not succeeded in a council. Like we always succeed. And I think that was the same with First Ed as well. If it's always going to succeed, then we could do more of a narrative thing, because there's a lot of narrative, and certainly the way you do it, Steve, around how the council work, what are you saying, and then it's which skill are we going to use, and we have to get a number of successes before we run out of time. When we go into them, I'm never really worried that we're going to fail them and deal with the consequences of failing them.
Yes.
We have failed on a couple of occasions.
Yeah.
We failed with that fella who wouldn't let us in. We had to sleep outside.
He was just really grumpy though, wasn't he?
Was that outside? Was it in Dale? Where you heard the king's advisor? We couldn't persuade him
Oh, yeah.
to come in. Oh yeah, he was a tosser though.
We
He
couldn't,
was.
we couldn't persuade those mercenaries to turn against that wretched wizard. Like, if you fail, this will be the consequence. So I think, and that's the same with a lot of social combat, to be fair, is I think that a lot of social combat systems don't give you the stakes, which takes away some of the jeopardy because you don't know what the consequence is. So if I'm going to be hit by an axe in the face, I've got a pretty good idea of what the consequence of that is going to be. Whereas with social combat, sometimes it's less clear. So maybe that could be a little clearer.
No, I get you. And I think you're right. I think most times you've succeeded. And I think it's one of the things where, as the GM, I've often said, it's time for a council. Whereas actually, I think it's more of something that could be more player led. So the players say, actually, we want this thing to happen and we want to get someone to do it. Let's try and convince them and we'll do it as a council, or as you say, social combat. I think it works. It's okay. As you say,
I like
it
it.
fails, but not often.
It is enjoyable, yeah, definitely.
I think, and it is also one of the bits of Secus 2E, which is basically a cut and paste from Lex Arcana.
It is very similar.
There are three methods of outcomes for council, though, isn't there? Success, failure, and success. So you could nuance it a little bit if you wanted to, rather than it to be successful or fail. But
Yeah. So you have your introductory role, so like courtesy role. I think it would be, yeah. I think it's just something, if you're a GM, you just need to be aware of, I think, and pay attention to. I think you're pointing about the stakes, Martin. I think making those a bit clearer, so it's a bit more, we need to get this right. Otherwise, we're going to have a problem.
The only problem I have with it is that it does seem to be, it's like there's a queue of you waiting to have a go, basically. That didn't work. And then the next person has a go. No, enough, next person. And it can seem a bit board gamey. It can seem a bit mechanistic because there's no interaction between what one person is doing and what another character is doing. So it's each of you hammering away trying to get that clock to go down. And I think it's the lack of sort of building on what each other's the interplay and so on. That can seem a bit mechanistic to me sometimes.
Yeah, I get you. In 1E, that was different in as much as you could have like supporting actions that would generate more bonus dice. And then you had the people actually doing the interaction. So it's probably a little bit the way, because a lot of our second edition gaming more recently has been
Tales of the Lone Lands.
Tales of the Lone Lands, yeah, okay. And so because it's their sort of set scenarios, so the councils, they're set out in that's what you do. But I think preparation, set it up. I think it's a mechanism that works. I think there's always a lot of benefit to making it a bit more narrative. But again, life's too short. You want to get back to hitting things with axes, frankly, don't you?
But what it does do, it does give those characters who perhaps aren't combat focused the opportunity to shine a bit. So if you think about Tony with Artie, his charming man from Bree, not the best in terms of a frontline fighter. However, he just came out with some, apart from the fact that Tony's very good at it, comes out with some fantastic sort of speeches and heartening and trying to convince people.
Yeah.
So it does give other people a chance to shine. Yeah, they're slightly lacking in another area. It gives them an opportunity to focus.
Absolutely. And it's serviceable and it does the job. It obviously just fits with the mechanics. Okay, so combat, great. Councils, yeah, does the job, great stuff. Then we move to the third part of the adventuring phase, which is, because as we said, the One Ring, you've got the adventuring phase and the fellowship phase. The last part of the adventuring phase is journeys, which to my mind is the least effective part of the whole game, really. It seems like it's just not quite hit the mark. You can see where Free League have taken influence from, amongst other things, the Forbidden Lands. Okay, they've tried to do a similar sort of thing, but just because of the way that the journeys work. So in Forbidden Lands, you have your journey each quarter day, you do this, that, and the other. Because the One Ring isn't that granular in terms of passing of time, it just, I don't know. Over to you guys. What do you think? Prove me wrong. What do you think about journeys?
No, you're right. Sorry, I have views and I'm going to sound like a retired major on any questions. So please try and stop me if it doesn't get better.
Go for it.
But the thing is, right, the subtitle of The Hobbit, right, was there and back again. It's not being there and being back again. Massive part of the whole thing is journeys, is traveling. It's not like Aragorn and the Hobbits left Bree. Then they arrived at Rivendell feeling quite tired. No, there's a few other things happened on the way. That's one of the best parts of the whole of the damn novel is the flight to Bree. Everything that happened there, sort of meeting all kinds of things, getting lost, attacked by Nazgul, then meeting Glorfindel, then attacked by Nazgul again. And it's all these things that happened. And it's all the other things that happen in the new system just would get ignored. It's like I fell over a tree root. I hate the first edition and again, Adventures in Middle-earth. They actually had a series of things, particularly if you looked at all the modules, the source books, etc. They had here are some things that can happen. Roll the dice and see what actually happens. And it's difficult. And you have to evade things and you're in danger. And with this, it's just like something happens, but that's not where the real focus is. And let's get on to the interesting thing. I think the balance is entirely wrong for that. And no more questions at this time. Thank you.
I think you're right. I actually went through all the supplements for 1E and pulled out all the sort of the things that could happen in a big spreadsheet to try and look at actually how could you map them over because it's basically, you travel a certain amount of time depending on the travel roll. Then, how you move, once you've traveled a certain amount of distance, you roll a feat die and then these things happen. And as you say, it's pretty basic in the core 2E rules. But adding those other things on, it's just more work for the GM, really. I think it's just something you just have to work through. I don't know what you guys think.
I like the basic system of the travel roll to travel a certain number of hexes, and then something happens. Yeah, that's good. If you're doing worse at that, more's going to happen, and more bad stuff's going to happen. What I did is just pre-prepare events that were going. I'd slot those in. I'd rotate between the other 3 rolls with the events. There'd be a tip each of those. But it would be a bit more significant than sort of someone trips over a tree root. It might be quite minor. It might be there's a storm that you need to find shelter from. Otherwise, you're taking endurance damage. Or it might be something more deadly.
Yeah.
And I think that feels right. And I like the idea then you can actually theme it to the area you're going through or to enter adventure. So I had one where there was some sort of hunt for war, and basically every event feed into that.
I think I would be totally with Rick and Paul there. So I'm doing this retconning of Bree from first edition. Yeah, it's the events outlined there, but great. All fit into the scenario. They can all be linked in to the drama that's the main drama that's playing out. However, in the defense of the journey, I hate running them. Running a journey is dull. But my players seem to enjoy it. Yeah, maybe, but I enjoy what we do with you. Now, also, I think the whole thing about tripping over a tree root, part of that's us, though, because Steve says, narrate a mishap. And because we have such a paucity of imagination, we always say, oh, I fell down a hole or I tripped over a tree root. So I don't think we can entirely lay that at the systems problem. I think that part of that is us. And the fact that, no, we tripped over a tree root. Get on with the next bit.
Yeah.
I think that's us as well.
And to be fair, there are in the second edition books, there are different encounter tables. So there are for things like around the Shire, etc. And they're very nothing particularly dangerous happens. It can, but usually it's all met a sheriff or whatever. And likewise, if you're wandering through the Midgewater marshes, different things can happen. But they're very light touch, which is fine. You don't need a lot of detail to it. But I think you're right, Paul. But again, it's more for the GM to do, is to prep that stuff, which is, again, you do the job and that's what you sign up for. But I think it just feel like, okay, let's just get through the journey to something else that happens. But
Thing is, you're prepping stuff even if you're running something official for that extra level of prep.
Yeah. When I would run one of the 1E adventures in Tales of the Wilderland, I think it is, where they're traveling through Mirkwood. And that, again, I was trying to fit in. I think what the 1E stuff does, Paul, I know you've touched on it. I think a few people have. Yeah, you get these richer encounters that you just don't get in second editions.
Yeah, because there was one in there where you've got that sort of swarm of butterflies that sends people to sleep.
Yeah, that's right. Very thematic, and
It's so thematic. It's beautiful.
they just fit in so well. I guess the other thing, what does the journey add? So if the journey isn't going to be interesting in terms of the encounters, and it's just a bit of a grind, and you lose some fatigue at the end of it, what is it's just something that batters you down without any real enjoyment and so on. And I do wonder, as you might in many other games, you might just say it takes you 2-3 days to get here, and this happens along the way, and there you are, and you're done. So I'm not sure what, the procedure, I don't think adds a great deal to the game.
One thing I did in 1E, where again I made it a bit fiercer. Party were tracking a group of orcs who kidnapped children across Angmar. They thought, as it will catch them, find the bad guy's lair and sort him out. And they did catch up the orcs just short of the lair. They'd thrown away all their armour to avoid being weary. And then trudged back with the hostages thinking, no, we can't face anything else.
yeah,
But that through the journey ended up throwing away their armour, any spare weapons, just taking the minimum. That was really nice.
So if you think about it in terms of actual outcomes, from to your point, Neil. So what happens is, okay, sometimes you can get a bit of fatigue, which makes you a bit tired. It only really matters if when you get to the other end, if you don't have, if there's time pressure and you haven't got time to rest. If you're traveling to somewhere which is safe-ish, you go, I'll just spend a couple of days here and rest. So fatigue is irrelevant unless you get caught in a combat on the way. Or the shadow points. Okay, so if you correct, obviously shadow points are an issue, and they can cause a shitty character. Might lose a bit of endurance. Again, doesn't matter unless you. So it almost, as we're talking about this, I'm coming around to the point. I think actually, I might just bin journeys in the future and just do something that's a bit more narrative. Maybe, okay, let's have a roll. If you roll an eye on your journey, then there might be something about shadow, and we could absolutely prepare an encounter around that one. Or it might be a combat thing, but actually, or it could be something that provides hope, like the butterflies, or you meet Gandalf, or whatever it might be. But a lot more narrative, because the level of crunch that's depicted in the rule, or set out in the rule book, doesn't really deliver in terms of benefit from a play perspective, in my view.
I think that's fair. I think the risk and reward isn't properly balanced.
When you think about what the game is based on, almost everything that Tolkien wrote involved heroic journeys. Lots and lots of different parts of journeys, passage through the paths of the dead and things like that. I think the issue is, what the journeys do is either you ignore it, in which case you're missing a big part of what Tolkien's basing everything on, or alternatively, you just create an awful lot of work for yourself as the GM. And I'm not sure they've quite thought it out. I wonder whether, actually the journey should work a little bit like the monsters do in things like Alien and Forbidden Lands, where you roll on a table for going from this place to this place. You would have these series of events happen. But
Are you suggesting a table?
how?
Where you randomise what happens.
I hate to be slightly pedantic, but it just feels like it's such a big part of the literature that is based on. They've missed a little bit of a trick, but I don't know I'm not sure how to resolve it, other than clearly a critical table, which would be useful.
I think as well, because the way that in the One Ring second edition, you've got these things called landmarks, okay, which are basically adventure sites. So in Forbidden Lands, you have adventure sites which characters can choose to go to or not go to. So it's very sandboxy, okay. I think what the travel rules as they're currently set out suit a more of a sandbox approach, although it hasn't got the granularity of Forbidden Lands. It's like, we're going to wander around here. So when you get to this adventure site, if you're really knackered, it makes difference because you're not going to get a chance to rest before something horrible happens to you. Whereas if you're traveling to Rivendell, chances are you're going to get a comfy bed when you get there and something nice to eat and a bit of a chance to rest. So I think it's what you've got. And so if you've got scenarios like Legends of the Lone Land, so the scenario book we played through, there are scenarios in that. And so I think it's almost like you got two different ways of playing: sandbox, or you got scenarios driven. I think what we've got is just this system doesn't quite fit between the two, really.
Yeah, I think one would work quite well. Be what Neil know what I'm talking about here. The OSR style of a point crawl, something happening to something happening at various things, and there may be a roll for each passage in between.
And you can still use the skills then, because I guess some of the skills are useful in travel, and so you'd still want to make sure there's some scope for using those skills. But yeah, I think it's something much simpler. As Paul says, you go from this point to this point. That we might have, 2, 3 random encounter rolls or chances of random encounters, and they can be things that you've picked that you think would be particularly thematic, or it could be a table.
Nothing wrong with the table, after all. But it feels like we're all in agreement. This is the weakest part of the game. I think there's something that needs to be done. I think 1E probably has got a little bit more to offer. Something that allows you to have a bit more engagement with the whole process rather than all a bit tired when I get to the other end. I haven't got a solution.
I think the relatively easy fix, which is just pre-gen encounters, prop on the way.
But you do that you could do that in any game. You don't need a system to do that, do you? You just go, actually, how many encounters you're going to have before you get to this place, and keep it simple like that. Let's talk about the fellowship phase. So part 7, chapter 7 of the book, fellowship phases. Okay. So this is a part where we talked about this right at the start. This is downtime. So your characters get to spend their experience. They get to increase their skills. There are other things, specific things they can do as well. And they call them undertakings. So I think there are some undertakings which are almost auto takes. And there are some which are really not very well specified at all, actually. So the things that are auto takes, there's one which is strength and fellowship, because that gives you your all powerful +1 bonus to your fellowship pool, which sort of refreshes at the start of each session. And that is critical. And I think I've ever known a fellowship phase when someone hasn't done that, or it's been allocated to somebody whose character wasn't there to do that, but it's always almost there. There are other things like writing songs. So songs can be useful for combat or for travel or for councils. And there's other one, which is, we'll talk about shadows later, whenever we get around to it. But there's also one, remove shadow points and healing scars as well. So shadow scars, they're really important. But there are others which are a bit, like gather rumors. You're hearing rumors, or your characters are hearing rumors all the time anyway. Or there's meet patron, which is you meet, so every fellowship can have a patron, and some are stronger than others, which we'll talk about at some future point. Over to you guys. What do you think? What are your thoughts about the fellowship phase?
Yeah. And again, I think we touched on it last time with journeys. Some of it is set up for a different type of game. So the whole point of Tolkien was that people are on a quest. They're not just wandering about waiting for something to happen to them. So gather rumors it's great if you want to run it like a sandbox. Fantastic. I think Gather Rooms is really good. We've had some fun with it with the home group, but it's not really like whenever you've really tried to introduce it, Steve, because you've given lots of little places on the map, but we've basically gone, screw that. We don't do side quests. We want to do
one.
We want to do the main quest
fear.
because that's the most exciting and most threatening and sounds like the most fun. Yeah. So when you go, oh yeah, but there's a little cairn of stones over here that you walk back. Stop that. I don't want to go and look at a cairn of stones. I want to go and face the hill of fear.
Really interesting.
I think when you're in the kind of groove of the main quest line,
yeah,
it's hard for a rumor to be gathered that's going to drag you away from that, unless somehow they go, oh, by the way, somebody there might be able to help you with the main quest, in which case you might go there. But if it's just, an elf has been seen moping about a tree, you're going to give it a miss, aren't you?
Someone else is new.
Yes. So I think it's different types of games. And I would say that the meeting patron thing, I don't think that's just a waste of time. And I know you've got something strongly against researching magical items as well.
Yeah, I would talk a bit about things like what they call the treasure index later. Oh, that is a major pain. Paul's shaking his head as well. Just major pain in the bum. But yeah, so I think meet patron could be useful if you're going to change your patron. So if you can say, actually, I want to go here and I'd like to be for this person to become my patron. But as you guys have chosen what we feel is the most effective patron from the outset, Kurdan, kick-ass Kurdan, as we know.
Gandalf, you suck. It's like
give Kurdan the ring. He'll be fine with it.
It's terrible. Yeah. He's cool. He's great. He's the best thing in Ring of Power, let's be honest. But anyway, yeah, so I don't know. What about the rest of you? Fellowship phase thoughts?
The trouble is it's leveling up, which is really the problem. With one of the problems with it. It does, we're not going to die. Great. Okay, looks like we're safe for this one. Second, now we get to spend all these lovely points we spent ages actually accumulating. And the trouble is that's where the focus immediately goes, because this is your one chance to do it. And particularly if it's Yule, where you actually get to do some really interesting and unusual stuff, and you get loads of hope back. The trouble is, because it's all that, what it would really benefit from, I think, if there was more of a push towards role-playing some parts of it, if there was some aspect to that, which meant you were actually doing that, and you were recounting how you're putting your feet up with a pipe in front of a broad bar, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not where the main thrust of it naturally goes. Finally, we get to actually get better at stuff, which doesn't happen very often. So there's much more of an emphasis on it.
You talk about the Yule phase. So you do get other phases the rest of the year. So usually in between every scenario, every adventure, you get a chance for a fellowship phase, but you're really restricted on how many actions you get. So therefore you naturally go to, right, we're going to strengthen the fellowship and then we'll do one other thing. Maybe, I don't know, whatever it is, let's write a song or something. But as you say, it's very mechanistic.
The bit I enjoy it is what Rick's talking about, the spending your experience. That's really all it's about. And kind of get level up and then thinking about the next adventure, because it's always significant when it's always after you've achieved something, or you've completed a quest or an objective. And we have this fellowship phase. Great then, particularly if you've built up a nice pool of skill points and adventure points to see your character improve. The selection of the undertakings is just a little bit, I don't know, we know what works, like you say, so we'll have this, let's crack on. And I think that's fine. I think it's the adventure phase where it's where the game is at, really. So I'm quite happy to just do 15 minutes, spending points, picking undertakings and tracking on with the game.
I think what I miss from first edition, which is, I'm being slightly unfair to second edition, because what I miss from first edition and every single supplement compared to second edition is certainly first, you had various very flavorful undertakings for particular locations. You might go to a particular site for your culture that might be great, it's brilliant, it's inspiring, it's a hard journey to get there. You go by yourself and you get some hope back, or you might hunt with the lads or something like that.
And you had to spend a fellowship undertaking to open a location so you could spend that time there, couldn't you? Or you had to do things. You couldn't just, I'm going to the Grey Havens for a week or whatever. You actually had to do something to make them available for you. But no, I agree. I think there was a lot of, so when we played the Rohan,
The Riddenite.
so things like you could open Helm's Deep, and if you spent time at Helm's Deep, then you got hope because you saw the glittering caves of Aglarond and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, which is actually perfect, isn't it? And
Yeah.
it makes sense to spend time there in order to do that or to get any benefit from it, rather than just going, yeah, that's good. There's glittering caves. Okay, that's pretty. Right, let's go now.
Any other thoughts?
I just wonder whether this is a section of the book that's perhaps pointing towards people who enjoy role playing and filming themselves for YouTube. Come on, Deirdre, write a song. Oh, okay. Role play meeting Gandalf and telling him you're sacking him because you're going with Círdan. I would love to do that. And I think it's probably people slightly more expressive maybe than us. I wouldn't say more camera hungry, because I think we're a group of people who are extremely camera hungry. However, I have a horrible feeling this is the come on, my darlings.
But the thing is that
There's a lot of YouTubers named Deirdre.
There are.
it's on your search history, is it, Martin?
Yeah.
Sorry.
But no, I think to your point, Dave, I think you could do, as you say, you'd probably, and what you say, Rick, you'd like to do quite a bit of sort of more role play type activity. Yes, you don't want it to be too all consuming because it is about getting on with the rest of the game. But actually, the systems as they are don't really support that. It's okay, spend your points, get your cultural virtues, try and get as much rid of shadow as possible, get some cool stuff about virtues or rewards or whatever, and then right back out on the road again. So it really doesn't give you that opportunity. But yeah, I think it's gone.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm interrupting again. Sorry.
Carry on.
What did start to work for me was being a bit looser with it. So asking people what they wanted to do. And they might want to say, I want to go and see the dwarf to see if anyone will ally with us in this coming battle or something like that. And various things. And then you can say, okay, let's just play out something quickly using more activities there as a guideline. So you could do that, or you could say, actually, you know what, we need to build the fellowship and things.
Yeah.
So it's sort of all to build on. So I think it works being quite loose with it. Then you've got more role playing. As for the songs, I mean, it's very Tolkien. I've never seen a player write a song.
Oh, we've got songs being written.
Yes.
No, and perform it. No, I'm not sure I'd want to see that. But
Or hear it.
Really. Well, yeah, don't hear it, yeah. But in terms of that, what I found one player's done before with me was saying, okay, yeah, this is a battle song. And this is a song of the Battle of the Ford, which of course was a battle they'd fought in the last sort of adventuring phase. And that was really quite cool. It was calling back to their own adventures for the songs.
I think you guys did that as well, didn't you? The song of the sword, or the song of the, I can't remember what they are. I'll find them for next time. But yeah, and so they all call back to things that your player heroes have done. Certainly combat's been helpful. Council, not so much. Journeys that you've done, which actually makes journeys even less impactful because you can't get weary on your journey, or it's less, because the journey, when you sing your song, it lasts for the whole journey. So if you're traveling like the whole breadth of Eriador, okay, it means you can no longer be weary for 27 days or however long. Whereas
you have to keep singing the songs.
I'm tired of this effing song.
It starts off with 250,000 green bottles, and off it takes them all the way to the lovely mountain.
Oh my word. On that note, we've filled another hour. We're gonna have to come. Are you happy to come back?
You know, are we at the stage where the ring has been destroyed and we're doing all the sort of mopping up after?
Yeah, the Eagles are coming.
Or are we in the appendices?
I think we're on the last bit, the slog up to Mount Doom, really.
Oh, okay.
So we'll say that Neil Benson is Gollum in this thing. So those of you reading along at home, chapter 8 brings us into It gives general stuff about how to be a GM and all that sort of thing, which is it's pretty perfunctory. Then again, I don't imagine that people are going to be coming to this book. Some will. It's not. I suppose it's a conversation about whether it's for people who've played a bit more. But anyway, it does the job. It talks about qualities of the Lore Master. It's really good about canon. It says just don't worry about it too much. So it tries to steer around that whole what year is it in type of thing. Obviously, we stick to canon religiously because that's how we do things here. But then it goes into tools of the Lore Master. Okay. And so this is, by the way, just stop me if I'm just going straight ahead. If anything you want to say, feel free. But then it goes into tools of the Lore Master. And this is an example of, which I've referred to before, is where the rules are all over the shop. They're in different parts of the book. So it's things like, it talks about skill endeavors in this bit. It talks about if you fail skill roll, or if the players fail skill rolls, what does that mean? So it introduces the concept of failure with woe, etc., which is really useful to know that. But again, unless you've obviously, they assume you're going to read this book cover to cover to get that information out there. So, any thoughts on that bit? Skill endeavors. I use that all the time. It's just crying out for a clock. It's crying out for.
I think just looking here, it's pretty much the same rules as for a council, isn't it?
Pretty much.
The council is a skill endeavor, but it's presented as a separate thing in the adventuring section. And I think that's, I don't know if it's word for word, but it's certainly very similar. They could have saved themselves a lot of time by putting the skill endeavors in the adventuring section and then just saying council's a type of skill endeavor with these things.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Skill endeavors are one of the things this rule set does is it just streamline a lot of the things and align from 1E. So you're right, it is essentially a skill endeavor, but also it talks about, it's pretty clear about what that means. And if there's an update to this in, I think it's in the Moria setting, Moria book, a little bit about skill endeavors at the back. So again, does a bit of a job. Martin, other people have got Martin first. Go on.
Okay, so just I haven't read the Moria bit because I think I'm embargoed from it until you run it. So I don't know if how they've reapproached skill endeavors, but to me, I know I'm bound to say this in a way, but Lex Arcana so runs a very similar system, okay, and obviously for obvious reasons, written by the same bloke. But what it's done better, I think, is it gives you examples of where you can use skill endeavors. So it says setting up camp, that's a skill endeavor. This is how you would do it. Infiltrating an enemy camp, that's a skill endeavor. This is how you would do it. Whereas I think the way it's done in this book, it's a bit, this is how a skill endeavor works. Over to you. I think some more examples of how you would fit skill endeavor into your scenario would be really helpful. Now you do it, Steve, because you run these things all the time. So you're used to doing skill endeavors. So you say, oh, you want to persuade or do an infiltrate, you'll do that to skill endeavor. And you can do it on the fly. I can't. I have to have a bit of a think. And I think it's a good tool, but I don't think it's sufficiently well explained. And I don't think it's streamlined enough that it's easy to do on the fly. But I do like it, concept-wise, love it.
And it's in common with lots of other systems, obviously 4E, Dungeons and Dragons and that sort of thing. But yeah, Paul?
I think I just want to throw in and say, yeah, it's a vital mechanic. It needs to be earlier in the book and it needs more examples.
Yeah, completely. What they do, it's actually in the Ruins of the Lost Realm in the appendix that they talk about that. So they'll actually change the time limits because I think in the original, in the core book, it's a bit easy. So I always use the optional skill endeavors because it makes it a bit harder because that's how I roll.
I mean, I think that's, I think when I was using the core version, I can't think of an example where someone failed a skill endeavor. And if everyone automatically succeeds, there's an easier mechanic for that, isn't there?
When we recorded last time, it's rare, if ever, that anyone's, probably because the characters are pretty competent, but also you guys know how to make a skill endeavor work, don't you? So you come across enough of them in my games to be able to get around it. Cool. Okay. Anything else wants to pick up on that one? There's a bit about sources of injury here as well. So things like cold, falling, fire, suffocation, but it's a bit of almost like an add-on rather than a core part of the GM's toolkit, if you like. But yeah.
I have a horrible feeling that parts of this section fall into my much hated 13th age type endeavor, which is, here's a rule, that's a rule, but if you want to ignore it, then go ahead. And it's a bit, I don't know. obviously being a fan of the one true.
Dave holds up Middle-earth role-playing.
Again, it's a little bit unspecific. However, I think it's quite well laid out, but as everybody else has said, I think it probably needs to come a lot earlier in the book.
Yeah.
So you're a bit more familiar with stuff and you're a little bit more happy about interpreting the rest of the mechanics and stuff that are laid out earlier on.
Yeah.
Sorry, on that point, how often is it used in the as written scenarios?
What skill endeavors?
Yeah.
It's not overly used. It occasionally pops up. It's mainly around councils, to be honest. So if I'm thinking about the series we played most recently, one of the offshoots, which the path's not travelled, was to go to the Dwarven Kingdom in the Blue Mountains, and there's a whole bit there around a whole skill endeavour council. But I think it's more left to the GM, and also there's not a lot made of sources of injury and things like that in there either. But I suppose it requires you to fill in a lot of the blanks yourself, which is why I say maybe it's not someone's first. It's not expected to be someone's first game, which is odd, really, because Lord of the Rings is obviously a very popular IP.
It's a missed opportunity, but there is also the starter set.
Yeah, completely. Rick?
Yeah, I was just thinking the whole thing about is it somebody's first game? It is lacking the, hey, Dave, why don't we have a game of the One Ring? It is lacking that, which does suggest that maybe it isn't designed to be somebody's first game, but I'm not worried or a little concerned that it's lacking that aspect of it.
But you'd think if anyone's going to be drawn to a role-playing game, it's going to be one that starts with the One Ring adventure in Middle-earth. To a new sort of idea, but I wonder whether that's a shame. But
I suspect the naming of it. So the One Ring is the great name, but there's the Lord of the Rings one, isn't there? Which is the 5th edition one, and I would imagine that feels.
Rick pulls that off his shelf. There it is. Is that my shrink wrap? Okay.
He's just laminated it.
I think that's more of a go-to, really, isn't it? I think that's somebody who's looking for it's just because they'd recognise the Lord of the Rings more than they might the One Ring. All
right, so this is interesting stuff. It's a little bit difficult to find, tucked away probably in the wrong place, but again, in terms of the actual mechanics, they work well as they stand, and I think obviously they're tweaking some of this stuff, hence the fact they've got these updating the appendices of supplements. But anyway, okay, then the next section, it talks about Loremaster characters, a little bit about those. What's quite cool, I think, about these is they have these distinctive features. So in the same way as player characters will have distinctive features which they can use to align with this use of hope to make characters inspired. Actually, if you're up against a character or an NPC which is a bit wary, that'll be a -1 dice off your stealth roll or something. And basically, it's just not. They don't use many. In fact, there aren't any opposed rolls in the Lord of the Rings. It's more about just rolling against a target number. I'll confess, I often forget about distinctive features, but it's in there as a way of just distinguishing some of those player characters. Okay, all right. Next bit is the shadow. Okay, all right. Really, quite a core part of the game, alongside hope we've talked about. This is the absolute counterpoint to that. Thoughts from you guys, really, in terms of how it works, what it feels like in the game. Is it different to 1E? Obviously, the mechanics are slightly different, but in terms of how it feels, what's your experience been?
Yes. I think it's actually the shadow part is absolutely superb. That duality with hope is absolutely vital to the Middle-earth feel of the game that comes across. So it's really important, really good. And I think the big difference between that and 1E is it gives you a bit more choice. 1E, you go down to being miserable, roll an Eye of Sauron, and then you have this bout of madness to clear your sort of temporary shadow. So it's giving more player choice, which is, I think, actually a good thing. So it's not hugely different to 1E, but I think the small differences do improve it.
Okay, so I think the way I read it was that so basically the mechanic is that let's say you come across a source of shadow, maybe dread or something, and so you're up against some spirit. So this would be a dread 2 roll, so you have to roll one of your virtues, like in this instance valor, to try and get, if it's dread 2, you need to get 2 successes to clear it away. If you fail or you don't get enough successes, you start to accrue temporary shadow points. Then at a certain point, if the shadow points reaches your current hope, then you become miserable, don't you? And that's what you're referring to then, Paul, I think, in terms of you can turn it in those temporary points into a shadow scar, which is much harder to get rid of. Okay, I think when your maximum hope, go on, jump in.
I'll jump in then.
Go for it.
I'm not a Paul Storm. I think the rule is if you hit your maximum hope with
Yes.
shadow,
Yes.
that's when you go nuts.
Yeah, and there isn't a choice at that point. You have to do it. So that's the thing. I think that's where the choice comes in, and that's where the shadow scars become so important, because you might think, oh yeah, I've got loads of shadow. I'll turn to I'll take a shadow scar, but they build up, and the only way you can get rid of them is during fellowship phases, and it's quite hard to do. And for some cultures, like for example, elves find it hard to get rid of shadow, and also Dunedain. So the long, what do they call it? The can't remember. Long defeat. Early on, it's temptation. Oh yeah, it's fine. I can take that bit of shadow. I can turn the shadow skull. But eventually, the economy is such that it becomes challenging. And I think, yeah, to your point, Paul, it absolutely is. It's key. And I think a lot of it is around how it's presented in scenarios. So we played, is it Legends of the Lone Lands? I can't remember what it's called now. What did we play?
We played Gareth O'Hanrahan's Death Machine.
Otherwise known as
the Lost Land, was it? Like, Tales of the Lost Land or something like that.
I did that. So that sounds a lot more what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's Gareth Hanrahan's Death Machine.
Yeah, okay. Because my experience of running previous things, so I ran like the horses, that's Wani, and that's got a different obviously that's different mechanic around shadow. As you say, Martin, the way that the current scenarios are presented. So, for example, there's one point where you go to the Hill of Fear. That was Gareth Hanrahan's Death Machine. It's a much darker approach, and shadow is a much more present mechanic in that.
And it messes you up, man. Shadow is brutal because it's much harder to avoid, because your valor rolls and your wisdom rolls are pretty pitiful. They require, it's much harder to improve your valor and wisdom. So you're making a roll where you've got a chance. So I think like all of us at some point got clobbered by shadow. You're walking around with 4 or 5 points of shadow, which means I think it's the phrase you use, your economy of hope, then it's like really precarious. So yeah, it's great. But it is brutal.
Yeah. Just before I come to the raised hands, and I think there's a lot of, in fact, I know there are a lot of creatures that cause, for example, dark sorcery. So it doesn't have spells as such, but a lot of creatures will cause you to gain, or at least to make shadow tests. And so there's a lot more in play, really. There's a lot more of a threat around that one. Neil?
Elements of it is you've got to be careful what you do as a player as well. One of your favourite tricks, I think, Steve, is to have these NPCs. I think we've referred to them in a previous part of the series. NPCs who are they just make you want to like stab them in the face multiple times, and then you get to a point where you can do that. And we've all said with some of these, I'll take shadow points, because like in other games, D&D, pretty much any other fantasy game, you recognize somebody's like a dick NPC, and it's a great pleasure in doing them in. But in this, you can't do it. Well, you could do it, but you're going to risk getting some shadow. So I think it kind of guides you towards a more enlightened path, where killing humans and dwarves and so on, even if they're nasty, isn't always the best option. I think it does give that really good balance for hope. Then that mechanic, me and Martin and Dave have got the longest surviving characters in this current game, and we're pretty battered from a shadow point of view. And then my character's got 2 shadow scars, and he only needs to get a few other points of temporary shadow, and all of a sudden everything becomes much more difficult in terms of what you use hope for, and then the decisions about how we spend hope when we have a rest and in the fellowship pool. But yeah, interesting, and definitely one of Steve's wicked little tools that he uses towards us.
Good fun. So I think there's a couple of things. So one is that, so with shadow, there are ways out of it, okay, in as much as you can have raise and air. So one of the things you can do is one of the endeavors is use either a relative or whatever, like your Frodo character, and you can pass on some of your skill and advancement to them, but obviously they're not carrying the shadow. So there's that piece. And also because this is essentially there's no alignment in this, but the alignment is basically you can do bad stuff, but you will fall to the shadow if you do. It's a choice thing, isn't it, really? And I quite like that all the agency is in the players' hands as to how they do that. You know, you can see your character who's been scarred and battered by fighting against the shadow retires off, and then their young apprentice or whatever strides forth only to meet the same fate later on.
No, it's okay. I was just going to say again, considering it could be and is a really important mechanic and one that really does make a big difference between this and other fantasy games. It's about 5 pages long. I think it could have done with a little bit more depth. I think also how the anticipation is that players will role play being a victim of the shadow. I don't think there's enough examples, for example, of how you might encourage people to play the shadow a bit more, as opposed to it just being it's a bit of a negative until something goes horribly wrong. That's in my opinion.
Yeah.
I think it's a fantastic mechanic.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely right. All his books,
you're in the right place for intellect.
All of his books deal with that sort of despair versus hope, don't they? When you think of Beren and Luthien and all the other sort of tales that are in and around the canon. And I don't think they've given this enough time and space central.
I mean, I think so. When you have these bouts of madness, so when your shadow is so much, it's overwhelming, basically, to overcome your hope. So you can have a bout of madness. You end up with flaws, and you end up with each time you have a bout of madness, you end up with a flaw based, and it's dependent on your calling. So if you're a treasure hunter, it's often you go in the path of greed and that sort of thing. But it mechanically, it is quite open. But I think it's one of the things where if you try to make it too mechanical, I'm all for mechanics and crunching things. But I think that I think there's a balance, and I think they're probably just about on the right side of it. But I hear what you're saying about, especially for newer players or newer GMs, it could be something they could take advantage of it really.
People are less likely to game the system. And some sort of probably would have been quite useful, I suspect.
Anyone else? Any thoughts on Shadow before we move on? It's pretty brutal. Yeah, go for it, Paul.
I like the fact that sometimes it's fair, sometimes it's a consequence of your actions. Sometimes it's actually brutally unfair. You meet the wrong monster in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah.
And that messes you up. And that's absolutely correct for the genre. That's what happens. You meet a Mazgul, you're a mess.
That's it. You're done. Yeah. Or just a Barrow White will do you in as well.
Or indeed Tom Bombadil.
No, the TripAdvisor review of sort of the Barrow Downs was through the
Would not recommend. Go for it, Rick.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you're going to get Shadow, if you're going to walk the ruinous path into the void, can I have some dark sorcery, please? Because there's so much, it's canon, you can learn it. And if you're going to do that, then absolutely go for it. And think about the temptation. Do I use it? Do I not use it? Am I using it for good? All of this kind of stuff. I'd like to, I know it's supposed to be a low magic setting, but I think it's a low magic setting in the Lord of the Rings. It's not a low magic setting in all of it. And I just think it would be fun to have a bit of that as well. Yeah. You do want, I know in MERP you can play a Black Numenorian.
Of course
you can do all kinds of fun. It's appropriate that you do actually play a hero in this, and you should actually behave in an appropriate way.
So there are fan homebrew stuff out there about how to create orc characters and that sort of thing. I think we talked about this at the start. It's not very Tolkien, but as you say, sometimes it'd be a bit of fun. I'm not averse to doing it, but I suppose it's just, I don't know. Maybe it's a different game. If you do that, it would be a different game, wouldn't it? So it would be a power trip, basically, because orcs are far tougher than humans. So play a troll like you can in MERP, the one true game.
We probably would have survived a bit better, I suspect.
You'd have just gone, great, let's join in. We'll have a massive fight. It'd be lovely. Cool. Okay. All right. So, Shadow, it's a good thing. Just be wary of it. So the rulebook then goes on to talk about adversaries. So it's got a good lineup of the things you'd expect in this. One thing I do is that, so in combat, so to your point, Neil, if you're up against orcs or creatures of the shadow, then there's no requirement to give them quarter or mercy. Whereas if you are up against men, So even if they're evil men or misguided men, low men, we like to call them, i.e. not doing a day, they've got resolve rather than hate, which is one of the mechanics that these adversaries use to sort of power some of their abilities. If you kill something with resolve and you didn't have to, that engenders shadow points. So that's where that comes in. That's quite cool. All right, so yeah, nice bestiary in there, gives you some options to things to do, and obviously all the scenarios provide that. Then we move on to treasure. We talked a little bit about equipment before, so this is not a Monty Hall game. You don't end up with lots of stuff. I quite like that. I think we've talked about how they're a bit sketchy up front. They're all very similar. But there is this thing, and it's called the treasure index, which I really don't like. The idea being that as a lore master, GM, you're supposed to look at your characters, survey what your characters or players like, and then carefully craft items that you then scatter in front of them to find that sort of play to their... Who's got time for that, really? If they're going to have I remember I think what I did was I said, okay, you found an item, go and make one you quite like. And you say it's not about making them as powerful as possible, but just making something flavorful, because then otherwise you end up trying to predict what players want, and that is that way madness lies. Frankly, I don't know what you guys think about that.
I quite like creating magic items.
So
that's a useful contribution, isn't it?
But again, I'm going to say I quite like it, but I like it for what it is trying to do and what it's not trying to do. So it's not trying to be you found a bunch of random treasure, roll on this and let's see what you get. Oh, look, you've got a brooch. This is supposed to be the magic items you create using the treasure index are supposed to be things that move the narrative forward. They're supposed to be stuff that people will die to keep hidden or die to find. So, because it means that treasure isn't just a kind of smash open the chest, let's see how many gold pieces are in. Because none of Tolkien's characters were motivated by money. Right? They're motivated by something like, power. Power is the thing, isn't it? I think the only time you hear money mentioned is like Barleyman Butterbur giving Pippin 30 silver coins for his ponies. And then going, oh, that's a lot. And that's the only time you get any sort of metric of the Middle-earth economy. Not 30 silver pieces, that's a lot. Other than that, who knows, right? There's no outside economy. So this kind of treasure is the only thing you can use. I like that. So you've either got 30 silver pennies or hoard, dragon's hoard. There's nothing in between. So why not use this treasure table to create those items? I like that. It's good.
I was going to say, it's not treasure really, but you do have what do they call it? You have an amount, is it wealth or something like that? And
standard of living, basically. Very stingy. I don't give much treasure out, to be honest.
You are such a tight ass, Steve. I've been
so many ways
to get a chain armor, and I've been fighting for you, and I'm thinking, surely there must be someone he can get some chain armor from, but because he's a povo, he's got no chance. In Middle Earth terms, I'm talking about there, of course, no offense intended. Yeah, I just think that would be, I don't know, it's very abstract, and it strikes me as a bit weird in a way that, like, you've got this much treasure, that is your standard of living, and because of that, you can't have a horse, and you can't have this armor, and you can't have a this and a that. It's weird, I think. It'd be nice to be a bit more old school and just go, if you want to buy some armor, we're probably the equivalent of 6th or 7th level characters by now. But I'd have thought of being able to buy some chainmail if I wanted to.
Hands up, who likes managing cash in campaigns? Neil puts his hand up. No one likes managing
cash. Getting something that kind of fits with your character within reason.
Grimvald has killed enough individuals over time, probably could have picked up a whole load of armor.
Exactly. But because his standard of living says we can't have one.
You wouldn't know he's a low man. He wouldn't know how to look after it, would he? Exactly. It's just better it's better you don't have it.
Yeah. It'll really tire you out on a long walk.
Don't worry about that.
Yeah, because low men don't wear armor. Yeah.
I think it's a lovely mechanic that they put together for coming up with how do you manufacture magical items. And I think that's probably true of an awful lot of this book.
Yeah.
There's a lot of thought been put into the mechanics of how you do it, but not a terrific amount about the application of it.
Mm.
You could be sitting there in a, unlikely for you, Steve, obviously, in an extraordinarily generously proportioned magical item part of Middle Earth, which we don't seem to be able to find at this stage, or you have these wonderfully crafted artifacts that sit there and nobody finds them. I think the mechanic's great, but again,
I'm very partial to a cursed item myself. I think they're great because, to your point, Rick, about powerful stuff. So sometimes you'll find things, but by using them, it starts to engender shadow because they've been tainted by being hoods. And I quite like that power, but also the cost. I quite like that. So, and again, we just recently put on pause the dragon coins that you were finding that were causing such upset that one of the characters, Tony, who's not with us on this episode, but his character had some of them and it was starting to affect his mind. And I quite like that. It's good fun. So, yeah. Yeah, I like cursed item. And then if in just working through the rest of the book, in time-honoured, the One Ring fashion, there's also a section on the Eye of Mordor, which is just a bit random at the end, okay? So the idea being that when you make rolls, the idea when you make a roll, okay, out of combat, so a skill roll, for example, if you roll an Eye of Mordor, then it adds to the Eye of Mordor, the eye score, basically. And in different parts of Middle Earth, so let's say if you were in the plains of Gorgoroth in Mordor, you need to have fewer of these eye points to trigger what they call a revelation episode. Okay, great idea. It's a bit weird in where it's placed in the book, and also it is what's a revelation episode. That is a role playing. That's role playing gold there. I don't think we've ever got to that point. It's quite hard to get there. You've had enough trouble as it is, frankly, with what has been put in front of you. But again, to your point, Dave, I think it would be quite good to have an example or more examples of that, really.
Lovely mechanic. You use it.
Paul, you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's nice it's there. I think in 1E it came across in a supplement. It's really nice to have that in the core. It's a handy thing because there's just that atmosphere of dread coming along.
Yes.
And coming into somewhere, say, going across the plains of Angmar or something. Again, it's dread mounting as that gets to the eye awareness.
And it's been open about it as well. So when we play it on Foundry, every time you get the eye increases.
So I'm going to disagree, I think, with Paul on this. And I think the problem is there's no real jeopardy. We've been playing for God knows how long. We've been in the blackest of black places, the Hill of Fear, the darkest of the dark. And we're still miles away from attracting the Eye of Sauron in terms of our shadow points. So I'm not sure there is real jeopardy. And then, like, you get the Fellowship phase, and it's like, we're safe from the Eye of Sauron now. So I just don't think there's enough jeopardy in the mechanic. I just don't think it's going to happen. I love it as an idea. And if you've played the battle game, Middle Earth Armies, the Middle Earth Warriors, there's a similar mechanic in that, which is really good. Get to a certain point, and Nazgul are on your ass. But here, it just that point seems to be really far away.
Yeah.
And so I don't really think it gives the jeopardy.
The fix for that could be, because obviously Shadow sticks with you, basically. And maybe you could do a similar mechanic with eye points, eye awareness, but actually it stays with you. And it might be that you need to do some specific actions to try and reduce it. I think it feels like something that probably could be mechanized a little bit more. And in fact, I'll start doing that from this point on. So all your fellowship, all your eye awareness, that's going to stay from this point on.
It's not, I think it's just use it like shadow scars. Once you hit 10 eye awareness, that's one permanent eye awareness. You're marked. And then you hit another 10, that's another permanent eye awareness that you can't shift. And then that way you become like real thorns in the side of Sauron. And pretty soon you won't be able to shift at all without getting some treatment. So I think, that sounds good. Go ahead, Steve.
Maybe you get stuck at Imladris like Elrond is. You can't move out of there because otherwise Sauron will be on him because he's known keeping an eye on him.
The only thing I was going to say on this particular one was it just adds more to the lore master, to the GM, doesn't it? It's another way of making another thing you've got to monitor, another thing. It's a lot to do.
What I was going to say is, rather than just tracking it and then having to come up with an encounter, if you just want to do it, just put something in the game and go like you would in any other game. if you want to have that, then I think that's how I'd do it. Like Martin's saying, it hasn't affected us so far. I suppose there's nothing for you to track because in Foundry it does it automatically. But if it got to that point of 14 or 16 or 18 points, then you'd be thinking about something. But if you think you'd like to have it in the game, I'd just come up with an encounter somewhere that would fit in and just put it in wherever.
I think you've had enough trouble, frankly, with that.
There you go. It's gone.
Well, to be honest, we haven't used it, so it's immaterial.
Yeah, house rule, it's gone. I am Mordor.
Okay.
I am Mordor is no more.
And there you go. We've been playing for how long? We've never used it.
Yes.
Does he have an eye? I mean, you know.
Who could say? Concept.
Yeah.
We've got the closed eyes of Sauron. Is what we've got.
All right. Okay. So yeah, just not the book could do a little bit of editing, reorganizing, really, just to finish the book off. So we've got chapter 9, the world, which is quite nice. So it's Pixar or whatever as that big open space. Great. Okay. Obviously, we talked about the travel rules before. I mean, there are things that are few and far between. There's not a lot in there, and hence it's the empty lands. But it's quite good. Whereas 1E was much more focused, I think it did the whole of northern Middle Earth, didn't it? Really. So you went to the Wildlands and also Eredor as well. But I'm interested to see what they do more. I mean, there's always the talk about a Minas Tirith or a Gondor source book and that sort of thing. Would be really cool. Admittedly, you can always use the cool stuff that's in the Middle Earth role-playing stuff, which of course may be purchasable on eBay if you've got £1 million.
How dare you?
But we'll come back to that in a second. So I think there's a really good use of the MERP supplements in terms of landmarks, because I think that that'd be quite good. Any thoughts on that before we move on? So the next bit is the appendices. They talk about patrons. We've touched on that before, really. That actually there's just a Kurd on a ship for the win. He must have a list of heroes.
Yeah.
Everyone's queuing up at his door saying, "Can be on your team, Kurdan." I don't fancy being Bilbo Baggins, mate. Whatever. Anyway. All right, then we move on to landmarks, which sort of is a bit of an afterthought in the book, which it doesn't really fit. And this is, I think we talked a little bit about, this is how Forbidden Lands does things like adventure sites. There's an example here in all the supplement, all the stuff that's come out more recently. There are loads of landmarks. So the Ruins of the Lost Realm, there's loads of stuff in there, which sort of plays into that more sandbox style of play. That's a hex crawl type of thing. But I think what would be really good, or what is a great link with MERP. So MERP was all about sites and lots of maps and making way through Wizards' Towers and stuff. You could quite easily just port that stuff into this, and the maps are good. That the artwork is great. They are pretty much. Dave's shown us his MERP supplements. Get your MERP supplements out for the lads. There we go. I say, nice.
You either got it or you haven't.
A nice Hillman of the Troll Shores there.
Is that what you're calling them?
Any thoughts about that? Any sort of reflections on landmarks?
This is something I wanted to talk about, was the supplements as a sort of an appendix to podcast, if you like. Well, I think the landmarks are really good. I've been running a fairly sandboxy little campaign with my home group. I'm running a narrative through it, which is free from first edition. And it's just brilliant. Great. Really good. It takes a little bit of prep to beef up a landmark so it's got a workable kind of in-game narrative and structure. Not much, though. Not much prep. And then off you go. It's brilliant. I really like it. And it gives the players a real feeling of agency. When you say, there's this, oh, don't forget this, and there's been a rumour about this, and you go, over to you. And I think that's really good. And then you bring it back to the kind of narrative of the books where there is like a central quest. Really good.
Okay. Neil?
Yeah, I didn't read the landmarks as you said not to in case you used them. But I've read the couple of pages that say what landmarks are. But what I think is really nice, is worth mentioning, is the map at the back of the book.
Yes.
Background's doing it. It's a beautiful map. It's got this lovely legend down the side with some of the journey rules, and it's just a really lovely map. I think it's a pretty decent book. Yeah.
The illustrations of the landmark sites work really well on Foundry with things like Fog of War and whatever. They're just good. I quite like them. And also they're quite interesting as well, most of them. I think when we played, I sprinkled loads of rumours and sites all over Eriador, and you guys just completely ignored it and went, Route 1, Hill of Fear. Let's go there and get our heads kicked.
Hindsight.
Yeah,
Rick?
that was brutal.
Yeah, a bit more farting about might have been a better idea. You're right. John, I did say it's just basically good job, because when it announced that Iridor was going to be the one, I thought that's great. It's the one that's familiar, but there is nothing there clues in the name. But they've actually managed to do it with landmarks, and I think that's a really good way of doing it. It's solved a problem. I thought, God, this isn't going to be easy.
First sight, Wilderland and Mirkwood did seem, in first edition, seemed a lot more interesting, a lot more going on. But actually, you're right, they've done a really good job with area developing that.
Sorry, I was just going to make the point I think somebody touched on earlier on. I think it was Rick. Well, Neil, the presentation of the whole book is absolutely fantastic. You don't tire of turning pages, and you inevitably find something new. So I think that's one thing that they've done extremely well. The presentation is absolutely beautiful, fits very much with Tolkien. You can use all of the various illustrations, even what looked like the sort of the stylized sort of monograms of
on the pages, with the edges and that sort of thing.
And it is a genuine pleasure to just flip through it. It's lovely. It's a really good thing. So I think one thing that they just definitely have done incredibly well is capture the feel of Middle Earth in the book and the way it looks. I think it just looks fantastic.
Yeah,
sorry.
No, it's all good. And I think throughout this extremely epic episode, we recorded on 3 separate occasions over the course of about 6 months. We have been critical, and we are critical, and we're saying actually this could be better, that could be better. But all those comments are coming from a place of absolute love, because this game is fantastic. I love playing it. I love running it. I love playing it. I think all of us have come back to the game and the system over and over again over the years, and I know we will do for years to come as well. So anyone listening to this, yes, we've got things we do differently, but it's absolutely a fantastic game from my perspective. I don't know if you guys have got any sort of closing thoughts before we finish off.
Well, if this is a trilogy, can we have like about 6 endings?
All right. On that note, no, we can't have 6 endings. We're going to just we're going to chuck this thing into the pits of doom, right? The crack of doom. No jokes.
Where it belongs.
Where it belongs.
I agree with absolutely loving the game, and I'm not one of Steve's players. I've been doing other things, been running a lot. Not begged Steve to come onto this podcast.
Please bring intellectual rigor to the whole thing.
Degree of gravitas that's normally missing.
Absolutely. All right, so thanks very much for sticking with it. Your insight's been really welcome. It's great to play with you guys and to run for you guys and that sort of thing. I know we'll come back to this game in the future. Woe betide the listeners who are going to have to make their way through this. This is going to be released in one big episode.
No.
Yeah.
Tolkien intended. That's what he wanted.
Yeah, all right, on that note. Thank you for listening to another exploration of my gaming vexes. If you've got any thoughts you'd like to add to what you've heard here, or a gaming vex of your own you'd like to offer up for discussion, you can get in touch with me on Blue Sky via orlanth.bsky.social or via Discord at orlanth.vex. Until next time, may all of your games be free of vexatiousness and be excellent to each other always.